Are you tired of playing by the rules in a game that was rigged before you were born? Have you ever felt that the only way to truly protect the people you love is to start doing what's necessary, even if it's unethical? Tonight, we explore the mind of a character who reached that same breaking point, and you'll see him in a brand new light. You may even find yourself asking, was he really the villain? Most people call him a monster, a ghost of war who wanted to put the entire human race into a permanent sleep. But as you close your eyes tonight, I want you to ask yourself a different question. If you were offered the power to transform your life, to control how people saw you, would you take it? And above all else, is it wrong to manipulate people, even for their own benefit? One anime legend had that same dilemma. So let's uncover whether he was a tyrant chasing a throne or a master of human nature who realized that to save the world, he first had to learn how to control everyone in it. Nearly a century before a boy named Naruto would ever wear a headband, in a land of ancient pine forests and even older stories, a boy sat by the Naka River and realized a dark truth. The world does not reward honesty, it rewards charisma. His name was Madara Uchiha, and he would eventually become the most dangerous strategist in ninja history, not because he was the strongest, but because he understood the hidden levers of the human mind. Tonight, we aren't just telling the story of the aura farming king. We are going to deconstruct the exact psychological tactics he used to reshape reality, like the one where he made his enemies and his own brothers believe their plans were their own ideas. Please proceed with caution, though, as once you hear this tale, it'll be very hard to take orders from your boss, teacher, or wife. These secrets aren't just for those who have the Sharingan. They're for those who are perceptive enough to decode the invisible patterns of human behavior that the rest of the world is too distracted by their phones to notice. On Madara's path, he'd sacrifice his closest ally, unlock the secret of the Rinnegan, betray his closest friend, and summon a devastatingly evil force on his own people that would traumatize a generation, and all for the greater good. You'll learn Madara's greatest realization, that the ultimate power isn't forcing someone to follow you, it's planting a seed in their minds so deep that when it finally blooms, they are certain the idea was theirs all along. By the end of this journey, you will see the world through Madara's eyes. But I have a second warning. These techniques have the power to bend those around you to your will, so you must use them wisely and only for good. Thus, Madara also serves as a dark reminder of how these same techniques can be turned against you and destroy you in the end, and in his case, by the very person he was trying to control. As you follow Madara's path, you will begin to recognize the hidden manipulations and manufactured dilemmas used to keep you in place by your peers and your leaders. You will laugh as you realize how foolish you've been. You'll learn the hidden art that strips others of their leverage and creates true, unshakable power, and many, many other such techniques. Most people spend their lives reacting to the world like a puppet on a string. But now, you're going to learn from the man who became the puppeteer. Tonight, we learn how he mastered his world, so you can master yours. Welcome, nighttime explorers. It's good to have you here with me on this journey. If you like falling asleep to an adventure while you learn powerful wisdom, then this space is for you. Before we begin, I have a question for you. What anime character do you aspire most to be like? Let me know in the comments. So, let's take a moment to reflect on our day. Was it peaceful? A bit turbulent? Did you achieve what you wanted? Or could you have done better? Whatever the answer, now is the time to let it all go and let your mind rest. That's all in the past now. These stories are most receptive when you relax, so allow me to guide you into a safe place of ease. Inhale slowly through your nose as you count to 6. Exhale slowly as you count to 8. Repeat. This kind of breathing allows your mind to settle and your body to rest. Repeat it. In for 6, out for 8. Good. Feel the tension melting away. Feel your head, neck, and shoulders relax. Then your back, your arms, your stomach, and hips. Feel them become as light as a feather. As you exhale, feel your legs and feet also relax. Good. Now you're ready to travel into another universe where one man made it his mission to control everyone. The cave didn't just smell of damp earth. It smelled of secrets. It was the scent of a man who had outlived time itself, a suffocating mix of dust, old parchment, and the metallic medicinal tang of the massive, jagged pipes plugged into his spine. They hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration, pumping a borrowed life into a body that was more scar tissue than flesh. Madara Uchiha sat atop a throne of gnarled, pale roots, his long hair hanging like a shroud of bleached bone. He was motionless, his eyes closed, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying stillness. To the boy lying in the dirt, shattered, bleeding, and hollow, Madara didn't look like a man. He looked like a monument to the end of the world. A ragged, wet sob broke the silence. Obito clutched at the white alien flesh grafted to his side, his breath coming in shallow hitches of agony. "It hurts. I have to get back. She's waiting for me." Madara didn't open his eyes. He didn't offer a bandage or a kind word. Instead, he leaned into the boy's psyche with the precision of a master sculptor finding the crack in the marble. "Cry, little bird," Madara thought, his mind a cold, crystalline lake. "Bleed until you are empty, because only when you realize that your hope is a poison will you finally be ready for my cure." "Look at your hands, Obito," Madara's voice finally emerged. Not a shout, but a low, velvet rasp that seemed to vibrate inside the boy's own skull. "Look at the blood under your nails. That is the only truth the world has ever given you. Everything else, your dreams, your village, the girl you love, it is all a loan, and the world is a debt collector that never stops knocking." He slowly opened one eye. It wasn't the eye of a grandfather, it was the eye of a predator who had watched the same tragedy play out for 100 years. He used calculated silence, letting the boy's despair grow loud enough to drown out his reason. "They told you that if you worked hard, if you were good, you would be happy. They lied." Madara leaned forward, the wooden pipes in his back creaking like a hanging gallows. "In this reality, wherever there is light, there must be shadows. As long as there is a concept of winners, there will be losers like you, bleeding in a ditch while the world moves on." He saw the boy's spirit falter. This was the destruction of hope, the first step in the long game. "I am offering you a mercy the heroes are too weak to give," Madara whispered, his voice dropping to a hypnotic frequency, the sound of a dark lullaby. "A world where she never died, a world where you never failed. I am going to cast a shadow over the moon and create a dream so perfect, so absolute, that pain will become a forgotten word." "But it wouldn't be real," Obito gasped, his voice trembling with the last of his defiance. Madara let out a short, hollow ghost of a laugh. "Real?" he mused, tilting his head. "Is your agony real? Is the fact that you were discarded like trash real? If reality is a slaughterhouse, Obito, why do you cling to the knife? I am not taking your life. I am giving you the power to rewrite it." He reached out a withered, trembling hand, the ultimate sign of hope. He wasn't forcing the boy. He was making the boy choose his offer. Help me, and we will erase the stars. We will create a world where no one ever has to say goodbye again. Tell me, in a world this cruel, what is peace worth? Obito stared at the hand. The silence in the cave grew so heavy it felt like it would crack the stone. And then, slowly, the boy's fingers twitched toward the darkness. But to understand how Madara Uchiha learned to weaponize grief, how he became the architect of a lie so beautiful it could fool the world, we have to go back, long before the cave, back to the river where a young boy still believed in the goodness of humanity. Madara Uchiha was born on December 24th during the chaos of the Warring States period in a northern province of Fire Country where the air was always thick with the scent of damp earth and sharpening steel. It was a place where the Naka River's bend acted as a natural border, and the old oak trees leaned inward as if whispering warnings to anyone brave enough to cross. His village was not a place of white picket fences. It was a compound of long wooden halls and black stone rooftops, guarded night and day by men with eyes like his, piercing, obsidian, and always watching. Childhood in the Uchiha clan wasn't marked by lullabies or school books. It was marked by the rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer and the frequent heavy silence of funerals. Even as a toddler, Madara was surrounded by kunai, fire, and strategy. He was the eldest of 5 sons born to Tajima Uchiha, a man who was equal parts warlord and prophet. Tajima didn't teach his sons how to play. He taught them how to survive. His voice was a rasping iron command. Strike first, speak last, and never reveal what you fear. He warned them that the enemy would weaponize anything you gave them, especially your grief. In this world, an exposed emotion was a target painted on your chest. The war with the Senju clan had been raging for over 30 years by the time Madara could form full sentences. They didn't call it slaughter in the compound. They called it duty. They called it legacy. They made it sound noble, like a sacred fire they were destined to carry. But Madara didn't grow up with ideas. He grew up with corpses. He still remembered the day his older brother was brought back, wrapped in white cloth that was too large for a boy of 12. He remembered the way the air smelled like pine smoke that day, a scent he would never be able to separate from the feeling of a cold hand. He would never forget the lie that came after, that the Senju would pay for this, as if vengeance could bring warmth back to a dead hand. It is a core principle of dark psychology that most manipulators begin not with power, but with helplessness. Madara learned young that to survive, you couldn't just be strong. You had to be unreadable, unpredictable, unbreakable. Every emotion you showed was a thread someone could pull to unravel you. So, at the age of 7, after watching his third brother die with a Senju's wind blade through his chest, Madara stopped showing them. That night, he didn't speak. He lay awake in the suffocating silence of the family house, staring at the ceiling beams and counting the cracks. He memorized every splinter and every knot in the wood, giving his mind anything to focus on other than the white-hot rage screaming in his chest. By age 9, the transition was complete. Madara had taken his first life, not with the clumsy hesitation of a child, but with the cold efficiency of a tool. The boy he killed couldn't have been more than 12. This was where Madara's real education began, not with scrolls, but with silence. He began to notice the things others missed. He saw how a split-second hesitation in a question was a telltale sign of deception. He noticed how a foot placed too carefully in the mud meant a trap was waiting 10 feet ahead. He realized that while fear could be hidden in a person's posture, it could never be hidden in their breath. He stopped thinking like a child and started thinking like a predator. The world, he realized, did not reward honesty. It rewarded control. Control of language, control of perception, control of the story. This mindset is what made his meeting with Hashirama so strange. Madara was 10, training alone near the edge of enemy territory along the Naka River, a place strictly forbidden without an escort. But Madara had always been curious about edges. That's where you saw the structure beneath the illusion. That's where things broke. Hashirama appeared like a shadow out of the tree line, all boyish grin and unguarded joy. He had a laugh that startled Madara, not because it was loud, but because it was free. In any other circumstance, they should have fought to the death. But for a moment, the predator hesitated. They challenged each other to skipping stones, then to jumping the stream, then to seeing who could throw a shuriken further into the bark of a leaning pine. By the end of that encounter, Madara experienced something he hadn't felt in years: ease. They became friends the way children do, quickly, fiercely, and without permission. They didn't talk about their clans. That was their silent, unspoken rule. Instead, they talked about dreams. They imagined a village where children didn't have to die, where fire could warm a home instead of burning it to the ground. Madara wanted to believe in that world. For a few brief months, he did. The dream shattered the day Hashirama hesitated. They were resting on the rocks, legs dangling over the stream, when Madara asked a question that would have meant nothing in another life. "What's your family name?" Hashirama froze, just for a beat. Madara noticed. He saw the shadow cross his friend's face. He saw the truth before it was spoken. "Senju," Hashirama finally said. Madara didn't shout. He didn't reach for his blade. He simply stood up, picked up a stone, and tossed it once into the river. Then he turned and walked away. It wasn't a betrayal of blood, but it was a betrayal of trust. The moment he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, the truth had become a weapon. That night, Madara stood alone on the training field. When his father asked if he had seen a ghost, Madara didn't reply, but when he went back to his room, he sobbed, deeply, uncontrollably, as all kids do when their dreams are crushed. After that, whatever remained of the boy who skipped stones was gone, and in his place was someone colder, darker, someone who stopped seeing the people around him as friends and family and started seeing them as a means to an end. By 12, Madara was already a field commander. He had mastered the first and most potent weapon in his arsenal, the illusion of choice. He once convinced a rival clan to break a decades-old alliance without ever making a single threat. He didn't use force. He used suggestion. He merely observed that the Senju's recent generosity looked like preparation. "When someone gives you too much," he told the rival leaders, "it's usually because they're about to take everything." He offered them questions, not orders. He gave them options that all led to the same outcome. He understood a dark truth about leadership. People don't actually want freedom. They want to feel safe. And the easiest way to make someone feel safe is to exude an aura of strength and reliability. They must know that when you're around, there is nothing to fear. Despite his hardening heart, there was one anchor left: his youngest brother, Izuna. Madara protected him with a devotion that looked like love, but felt more like desperation. He was the only one who still saw the boy behind the mask, the one who lingered near rivers after a battle, looking at the sky as if searching for a version of himself he'd left behind. By 13, Madara Uchiha was neither a villain nor a hero. He was a strategist. He had learned that it's not the loudest man in the room who wins, it's the one who waits, the one who watches, the one who lets others expose themselves first. He didn't build peace because he believed in it. He built it because he knew what happens when it collapses. He had watched the world collapse since he was 5. Madara never forgot that first lie, that a Senju could be a friend. He never forgot the humiliation, the clarity, and finally, the control. By the time he hit his teens, Madara didn't just walk into rooms quietly. He walked in having already decided how everyone in that room would feel by the time he left. The seeds were planted, the warmth was gone, and the boy who once chased peace with a skipping stone was already designing a world where no one would ever be able to lie to him again. But even the greatest architect cannot account for every variable. And for Madara, the variable he missed was the one person he actually loved. Madara Uchiha never cried after the day the river divided him from his friend, not when he broke 2 ribs in a grueling sparring match against his father, Tajima, not when his hands bled raw from gripping the hilt of a blade until dusk, not even when another clan boy, 9 years old, died with a blade in his back and a look of surprise still frozen in his eyes. Whatever softness lived in him had been buried so deep that he sometimes wondered if it had ever been there at all. He didn't just hide his emotions, he began to treat them like a limited resource. Every tear was a leak in the hull of a ship. Every smile was a vulnerability. But there was one place he allowed himself to remember the boy he used to be: the Naka River. Specifically, a flat stone just west of the current, where the moss was thick and the trees grew low. This was the sanctuary where he and Izuna used to talk. In those early days, they never said anything important. They didn't discuss the geopolitics of the Fire Country or the way their father's eyes seemed to look through them, searching for weapons instead of suns. Mostly, they skipped stones. They counted the skips, tried to outdo each other, and laughed. But the quiet there mattered. It was the only place in their world that didn't echo with the rhythmic thud of training or the tension of a looming raid. And yet, even that peace had a deadline. By age 11, Madara no longer skipped stones. He studied war maps instead. He traced clan migration routes until the ink stained his fingertips. He memorized chakra signatures like a musician memorizes notes. He learned the names of Senju tacticians, their preferred formations, and the exact distance their vanguard squads could cover in a single night. He memorized where the traps were laid, where the forest could be trusted, and where it couldn't. This was the birth of the Uchiha strategist. He realized that information was the only thing that could prevent the white cloth of a funeral shroud. The mask didn't come all at once. It began as a habit: the tightening of the jaw, the refusal to look tired, the silence when asked how he felt. Then came the steady voice and the unbroken eye contact. He mastered stillness, not as a discipline of peace, but as armor. In psychology, this dark technique is known as the power of withholding. What others called stoicism, Madara called safety. He had discovered a core principle of human manipulation. The person who speaks the least often holds the most power. In any social interaction, the one who remains silent forces others to fill the void with their own insecurities and secrets. By withholding his reactions, Madara became a mirror. People saw in him what they feared most or what they respected most, but they never saw him. He learned the truth. The more people know about what hurts you, the easier it is for them to manipulate you. Izuna noticed the change first. It wasn't through questions, but through the growing distance between them. The conversations by the river grew shorter. The laughter faded into a polite, professional chill. Madara didn't mean for it to happen, but the more he buried, the heavier it became. And heaviness, he found, makes a person sink alone. Then came the mission that would cement his reputation. It was a brittle winter morning. The sun was slow to rise, filtered through a silver mist that clung to the trees like the ghosts of the fallen. Madara, now 12, stood at the edge of the forest near the southern range. His breath was steady, a rhythmic puff of white in the frozen air. Behind him stood his squad, 3 older boys from the Nara Alliance and 1 younger girl, Aiko, from the Natsume line. She was barely 10, with small hands and sharp, terrified eyes. They had been sent to shadow a Senju scouting unit. The orders were clear: observe, record, report, no engagement. Madara crouched beside a frost-covered root. He traced a boot print in the mud, noting the drag of the toe. "They're fast," he murmured. The others nodded, their breath hitching. Every crackle of ice underfoot felt like a thunderclap. When they reached the ravine, the world exploded. A tripwire snapped, and a cloud of thick, acrid smoke erupted from the underbrush. Most children would have screamed. One of the Nara boys, Daigo, did exactly that. He panicked, pulled his blade, and charged blindly into the smoke, violating every rule of engagement Madara had set. Madara didn't shout. He didn't freeze. He observed. Two Senju emerged from the haze, kunai drawn. Madara didn't attack them directly. He threw two shuriken past them, hitting the trees behind them. It was a psychological feint. The Senju, fearing a pincer attack, shifted their weight. That half-second of doubt was all Madara needed. He dropped from the trees like a predator. A clean kick to the chest of the first, a spinning elbow to the temple of the second. But Daigo was still flailing in the smoke. Another Senju appeared behind him, blade raised for a killing blow. Madara saw it. He could have shouted a warning, but he knew that in the chaos, a shout would only cause Daigo to freeze. Instead, Madara surged forward, intercepting the enemy with a wall of fire, just enough to force a retreat, but not enough to reveal his full strength. He didn't care about Daigo's gratitude. He didn't expect it. He was managing the board, not the people. The battle ended as quickly as it began. The Senju fled, leaving behind a single scorch mark on a tree. Aiko sat on the ground, her knees pulled to her chest, trembling. "He shouted," she whispered, looking at Daigo. "We could have all died because he shouted." Madara didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer judgment. He simply stood there, a pillar of absolute stillness. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to have already processed her death and moved on to the next mission. That silence did something that words never could. It created social proof. Because Madara remained calm, the others felt ashamed of their fear. Because he didn't explain himself, they assumed he had a master plan. They were too inexperienced to understand. The next day, Aiko walked closer behind him. 2 weeks later, she requested a permanent reassignment to his squad. She didn't follow him because she liked him. She followed him because his silence made her feel safe. Tajima noticed the change too. He looked at Madara with something close to respect, or perhaps relief, as if a wild horse had finally accepted the bridle. Madara began leading more missions, not because he was the strongest, but because his expression didn't change when people died. He became known for his clarity. When his men hesitated, he didn't raise his voice or give a rousing speech. He simply waited, and somehow that was worse. The silence pushed them forward more effectively than orders ever could. They worked harder just to earn a single nod of approval from the boy who never smiled. He was learning to give just enough praise to earn loyalty, just enough warmth to seem human, but never enough to become predictable. He told himself the mask was temporary, that one day, when the war was over, he would return to the riverbank and let the boy beneath the surface breathe again. One night, he did go back. The river was lower than he remembered. The stone where he and Hashirama, and later he and Izuna, had sat felt smaller, colder. He sat alone, waiting for a memory or a feeling to return. But all he found was the sound of the water, indifferent to his war. Izuna joined him after a few minutes. "You're different now," Izuna said, his voice small against the rush of the river. Madara didn't respond. "I miss when you used to talk, really talk." "Talking doesn't win wars, Izuna," Madara replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy fires burned. Maybe not, Izuna said, standing up, but it reminds people you're still human. As Izuna's footsteps faded into the woods, Madara remained unmoving. He was the master of the mask, the architect of silence, and the rising star of the Uchiha. He had everything he thought he needed to protect his brother. But there is a dark irony in the psychology of protection. The more you harden yourself to save someone, the more you lose the very part of you they loved. Madara thought he was building a shield for Izuna. He didn't realize he was building a tomb. And the next time they would stand together in a field, it wouldn't be to skip stones. It would be to face the ultimate price of Madara's silence. But the true horror wasn't the death of his brothers. It was the birth of a power that required the ultimate sacrifice, a power that can only be awakened by the very grief Madara spent his life trying to outrun. The mission had taken them south, past the fractured, bone-white riverbeds of the warring plain and into the damp, pine-shadowed valleys of Mount Hagoromo. 3 days in enemy territory, and the very texture of the air had shifted. It was wetter, stiller. It was the kind of silence that didn't suggest peace, but rather like a predator holding its breath. That morning, the Uchiha tents held a specific kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of rest. It was the silence of waiting. Madara sat just outside his tent as the sky turned the color of cold ash. In front of him, a map lay open, its corners weighed down by smooth river stones, the same stones he once used for skipping. To his left, Izuna sat cross-legged, the dull, rhythmic sound of a whetstone against a kunai providing the only soundtrack to the dawn. It was a nervous habit. Izuna was sharpening a blade that was already lethal. The night before, a joint operation had been proposed. The Nara clan, strategic geniuses in their own right, were requesting assistance along the southern border where Senju scouts were pressing hard. Tajima, Madara's father, had initially declined. He saw the Nara as a distraction, but Madara had intervened. He didn't argue, he didn't plead. He simply spoke to the Nara envoy privately, away from the prying eyes of the elders. He did it without asking for permission, not because he believed in the alliance, but because he needed the Nara to believe they had chosen the Uchiha freely. Madara gave the Nara 2 options: suffer escalating Senju incursions alone and risk total collapse of their southern flank. Accept a temporary strategic overlap with the Uchiha. He didn't call it a merger. He didn't call it a rescue. He used language that preserved their ego. He framed the Uchiha not as masters, but as a resource. They picked the second option, gratefully. They thought they had outmaneuvered the Uchiha into helping them. Madara knew the truth. When you give someone 2 options that both serve your interests, the one they choose becomes their own idea. They will defend it to the death, because to admit the choice was a mistake is to admit their own judgment failed. They set out before the sun could break the horizon. A 3-man Uchiha unit led by Madara, with 2 Nara scouts waiting at the base of the mountain. The forest floor was a sponge of moss and decaying needles, muffling their footsteps until they were ghosts moving through the mist. "If they ask why we're here," Madara whispered without looking back, "tell them we are here to observe and support. We are guests of their strategy." Daigo, a younger Uchiha who had seen Madara's cold efficiency in the previous weeks, frowned. "But we're the ones leading this, right? We have the Sharingan. We see the traps before they do." Madara stopped. He didn't turn around, but the air around him seemed to drop 5 degrees. "Daigo," Madara said softly, "do you fight better when you feel watched, or when you feel trusted?" The question hung in the damp air like a threat. Daigo didn't answer. He didn't have to. That was the core of Madara's evolving philosophy. The most effective leash is the one the dog doesn't know it's wearing. The Nara scouts greeted them past the first ridge. They were cautious, polite, and clearly on edge. One of them, a 17-year-old with the signature Nara ponytail, bowed deeply. "We are grateful for your support in our mission," he said, emphasizing the ownership. Madara returned the bow with a precision that was almost mocking. "You chose wisely," he replied. Throughout the day, the mission went with terrifying smoothness. They spotted 2 Senju scouts near a mountain stream. Madara didn't bark orders. Instead, he leaned over to the Nara leader and whispered, "The terrain to the left looks like a perfect place for your shadow paralysis. What do you think?" The Nara leader nodded, thinking he had made the tactical call. The Senju were repelled without a single Uchiha drawing a sword. By sunset, a Senju supply cache had been burned, and the Nara were beaming with a sense of accomplishment. But the real victory happened that night. When those scouts returned to their clan, they didn't report that the Uchiha had taken over. They reported that the Uchiha were excellent consultants. They claimed they had remained in control the whole time, and yet every single inch of ground they covered was exactly what Madara had mapped out 3 days prior. Back at the Uchiha camp, as the fire crackled low, Izuna finally voiced the question that had been burning in him. "Why didn't you just give them direct orders? You're smarter than them, Madara. We could have finished the mission in half the time if you just took charge." Madara was cleaning his armor, the metal gleaming orange in the firelight. He didn't look up. "If I give an order, they follow it once out of obligation," he said. "If I give them a choice, they defend that choice forever out of pride. I don't want soldiers who obey. I want allies who believe they are the ones in control." Izuna blinked, his youthful face twisting in confusion. "Doesn't that feel like lying?" Madara met his eyes then. The obsidian of his pupils seemed to swallow the firelight. "No," Madara said. "It feels like peace. If everyone thinks they are getting what they want, no one fights. That is the only way to end this war, Izuna. We manage the world until it stops bleeding." Izuna dropped the subject, but he stood a little further away from the fire that night. Madara noticed. He noticed the way Izuna didn't offer a stone to skip the next morning. He noticed the way the silence between them was no longer a bridge, but a wall. 2 days later, Madara decided to test his theory on his own men. He called a debriefing. He told them they had 3 options for the next strike on a Senju outpost: a direct assault, a pincer movement, or a slow, agonizing infiltration through the marshes. Each had risks, but Madara wanted the infiltration. He knew a direct assault would cost lives he wasn't willing to lose yet. He didn't tell them to choose the marsh. Instead, he used reverse psychology. "The infiltration is the most effective," Madara said, his voice trailing off with a hint of manufactured doubt. "But I'm not sure this squad has the patience for it. It requires a level of discipline that most shinobi can't maintain for 6 hours in the cold. Maybe we should just stick to the direct assault. It's easier." The effect was instantaneous. "We can handle it," Daigo snapped, his pride wounded. "We aren't most shinobi," another added. They chose the infiltration unanimously. They walked into a freezing swamp for 6 hours, not because Madara ordered them to, but because they wanted to prove him wrong. They wanted to prove they were worthy of the choice they thought they had made. Madara didn't smile as they waded through the waist-deep water that night, but inside, something clicked. He wasn't just a ninja anymore. He was a designer of belief. It didn't feel like manipulation yet. It felt like strategy. It felt like a clean, bloodless way to ensure the Uchiha survived. He was planting decisions in the minds of others like seeds and watching them grow into a forest of his own making. But as he watched Daigo repeat his exact words to a younger scout, word for word, as if they were his own, Madara felt a strange coldness. The mask was tightening. He was no longer planting decisions, he was planting decision-makers. He was creating a world of echoes. After the successful mission, Madara stands on the edge of the camp, looking toward the Senju territory. He has mastered the art of the illusion. He has learned how to bend the will of allies and enemies alike without ever raising his voice. But there is one variable he hasn't accounted for. Power earned through agreement is clean, but love is a messy, unpredictable thing. And as Madara begins to apply his art of manipulation to the one person he loves most, Izuna, he is about to learn that some hearts don't bend, they break. And now we will see what happens when the illusion of choice meets the reality of a blade. Because while Madara was busy designing peace, the Senju were busy designing a counter-move that would force Madara to make the only choice he never wanted to have. The winter after the marshland offensive, the Uchiha returned to the mountain compound. Snow covered the old training grounds in a quiet, suffocating hush, the kind of blanket that doesn't just hide the grass, but seems to muffle memory itself. Smoke rose in thick, lazy plumes from the blacksmith's forge. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. It was real laughter, not the sharp, forced barks of drills disguised as play. For a moment, there was peace. Not the fragile, paper-thin ceasefire of politics, but a real, breathing peace. Madara stood at the top of the ridge, his cloak catching the biting wind. Below, he watched Izuna run laps. His brother's movement was poetry, sharp, confident, rhythmic. In those rare stretches of quiet, Madara allowed himself a dangerous luxury. He let himself believe. He believed that the pain, the cold calculations, and the bodies he had stepped over were actually leading somewhere worth reaching. He even smiled, because for a few short weeks, it felt like they had already won. But Madara's education had been too thorough for the smile to reach his eyes. Peace, he knew, was not the absence of war. It was merely the pause between campaigns. It was the time a predator took to lick its wounds before the next scent of blood hit the air. Not all the Senju had stayed quiet during this lull. While Hashirama spoke of dreams, his younger brother, Tobirama, was busy designing the reality to kill them. Madara had never met the man directly, but he felt his presence in every engagement. Tobirama was precise, tactical. He was the kind of man who measured peace in risks rather than hopes. He didn't see a village. He saw a series of logistical vulnerabilities. Madara was weary of him. He recognized in Tobirama a mirror, someone who could see straight through a manipulation because he practiced the same dark arts of logic. This created a new kind of tension in Madara's mind. If he couldn't outsmart the enemy through logic alone, he would have to master a force even more potent: belief, the psychology of sunk-cost loyalty. Madara remembered a night after a failed recon mission. 2 days in enemy territory with no food and no fire. Madara had a bruised rib that made every breath feel like a serrated blade, and Izuna had a jagged cut across his cheek that stained his collar dark. They hadn't even made it to the border. Tajima, their father, stood waiting in the center of the camp, silhouetted against the dying embers of a fire. "Whose idea was the Western Ridge?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was cold, which was worse. It was the sound of a ledger being balanced. Madara opened his mouth to take the blame, but Izuna spoke first. "Mine," Izuna said, his voice steady despite the blood on his face. Tajima looked at them both, his gaze lingering on Madara's eyes, the Uchiha's greatest asset. Then he turned and walked away. Later, in the privacy of their tent, Madara asked why Izuna had lied. Izuna shrugged, a small, painful movement. "Because you had the better eyes, brother. We couldn't afford to lose them to father's discipline." That was the kind of loyalty they shared. It wasn't spoken, it was lived. But as Madara's mind grew darker, he began to analyze that loyalty not as a gift, but as a lever. He realized that love is the ultimate psychological vulnerability. If someone loves you, they have already given you the keys to their reality. The shift happened during a mission near the southern marshlands. Madara faced a tactical crossroads: burn an enemy bridge, cutting off a civilian village from their food supply for a week, or leave it intact and risk a Senju pincer movement that could wipe out an Uchiha scouting party. Izuna hesitated. He looked at the smoke rising from the village chimneys. "There are children there, Madara. We know that." Madara didn't flinch. He used a technique known as future pacing terror. "And if those children grow up to become shinobi?" Madara asked, his voice dropping to a whisper of absolute certainty. "If they come for our children? We do this now, so our people don't have to do it later. Are you willing to trade an Uchiha life for a Senju's dinner?" "But that's a guess," Izuna countered, "not a fact." Madara turned his full focus on his brother. This was the moment of manipulation, the gaslighting of idealism. "You once told me you'd follow me," Madara said, leaning in. "You said you trusted me to see what others can't. Was that trust only valid when the choices were easy? If you doubt me now, you aren't just doubting a plan, you're doubting the survival of our clan." He made the choice about loyalty, not about the bridge. Izuna looked away, the weight of the sunk cost of his previous loyalty pressing down on him. He had already sacrificed so much for Madara. To stop now would be to admit all that sacrifice was for a monster. The bridge burned before nightfall. The reframing of love. Back at camp, Madara watched Izuna through the dancing orange flames of the campfire. His brother was quiet, focused, but the spark of easy laughter was gone, replaced by a grim, mechanical obedience. Madara felt a pang of grief, but he suppressed it, cataloging the reaction like a scientist. This is what it meant to lead, to wield trust like a blade. He began to use incremental compliance. He would float a small, dark idea in conversation, something cold, something ruthless, and let Izuna sit with it. He would wait for Izuna to rationalize it to himself, then return later, as if the idea had been Izuna's all along. It worked, again and again. Izuna, who still thought he was protecting his brother's soul, didn't see that he was the one being shielded. He was being shielded from the truth of who Madara was becoming. Madara used love to create a positive feedback loop. Every time Izuna agreed with a ruthless plan, Madara rewarded him with affection and inclusion. Every time he hesitated, Madara withdrew, creating a cold vacuum of isolation that Izuna couldn't stand. The descent into calculation. One evening, they stood at the edge of the Naka River. Madara skipped a stone, watching the ripples chase each other into nothingness. "We're close," Madara said, "to peace, to ending this cycle of funerals." Izuna didn't look at the water. "Sometimes it feels like your peace is just a different kind of war," he said quietly. Madara smiled, but it was the smile of a man who had already seen the end of the world. "Maybe, but it's a war I can win." He didn't say we. It wasn't a conscious slip, but Izuna noticed. The I signaled the final transition. Madara no longer saw them as two brothers fighting for a dream. He saw himself as the architect and Izuna as the foundation. And a foundation isn't meant to have an opinion. It's meant to hold the weight. "You've changed," Izuna said. There was no anger in his voice, only a profound, hollow sadness. Madara didn't deny it. To deny it would be to show weakness. "I had to," he replied. "The world doesn't allow the soft to stay whole." Izuna nodded once and walked back toward the tents. Madara stayed by the river, staring at the stars. For the first time, a cold shiver of genuine fear ran down his spine. It wasn't the fear of the Senju or the fear of death. It was the fear of the refusal. What would happen if the person he loved most finally refused to be leveraged? What if the illusion of choice failed against the purity of a brother's heart? The looming shadow. In the distance, beyond the Uchiha borders, a new alliance was stirring. It was larger than anything they had faced, a coalition of clans tired of the blood. It would require more than persuasion. It would require a total surrender of identity. Madara knew he would need Izuna's total belief to navigate what was coming. But as he watched his brother's retreating shadow, he realized that belief is much harder to win than obedience. It is, however, much easier to fake. Madara began to plan his most ambitious manipulation yet. He wouldn't just lead the Uchiha, he would become their destiny. And to do that, he would have to prepare Izuna for a sacrifice that neither of them could yet imagine. The wind picked up, whistling through the oak trees like the ghosts of the brothers he had already lost. Madara tightened his grip on his kunai. The lever of love was set. Now he only needed the right moment to move the world. But the problem with using love as a tool is that tools eventually break. And when a heart like Izuna's breaks, it doesn't just shatter. It ignites a fire that even the Uchiha cannot control. Madara was 17, not quite a boy, yet not yet the legend that would one day haunt the dreams of the Five Nations. He was a warrior standing on the jagged edge of what had once been a battlefield, watching the wind ripple through tattered banners that no longer opposed each other. The blood-soaked years had suddenly gone quiet, and to a man like Madara, that silence felt suspicious. He could still picture the violence with terrifying clarity. Just weeks earlier, the battlefield at Nakano Ridge had been a graveyard of ambition. Trees were splintered into toothpicks by high-level jutsu. Rivers ran a deep, sickly red. The sky was a bruised purple, smeared with the smoke of the Uchiha's great fireball technique and the Senju's water walls. They had charged each other like destiny itself depended on the slaughter. But it had ended, not with a final conquest or a pile of bodies high enough to claim victory. It had ended with an outstretched hand. Hashirama. He had come alone. No guards, no chakra crackling at his fingertips in a show of force. Just his voice, low, steady, and broken in all the places that war breaks a man. "Enough," he had said. He wasn't just speaking to Madara. He was daring the world to continue bleeding. Madara hadn't spoken at first. He just looked at the man he had once raced up waterfalls with, the boy whose dreams used to sound like the rambling of a fool. But Hashirama had kept dreaming, even as the world tried to wake him with a blade. Eventually, Madara said yes. He told his clansmen it was strategy. He called it a tactical regrouping to soothe the elders who still tasted Senju blood in their mouths. But in truth, it felt like something heavier. It was a surrender of momentum. War has its own logic, its own heartbeat. To stop was to feel. To stop was to remember the brothers buried in shallow graves. To stop was to admit they had become strangers to their own humanity. Peace came, clumsy, awkward, and unbelievable, but it was not a clean slate. Tobirama Senju, Hashirama's younger brother, had been notably absent from the initial treaty table. He was the cold logic to Hashirama's burning heart. While Hashirama spoke of will, Tobirama spoke of containment. "I don't object to peace," Tobirama had reportedly told the Senju Council. "I object to trusting people who have made a legacy of vengeance." Madara knew of Tobirama's reputation, methodical, brutal, and effective. He was the kind of man who didn't attack where he wanted victory. He attacked where he wanted to leave a warning. Madara felt Tobirama's eyes on the back of his neck every time he walked through the newly cleared forests of what would become the village hidden in the leaves. He knew that Tobirama was waiting for the mask to slip. In this strange, quiet era, Madara began his most sophisticated psychological campaign. He didn't grab for power with a closed fist. He climbed it with an open hand. This is the dark art of commitment and consistency, or the yes ladder. The principle is simple. If you can get someone to agree to a small, reasonable request, they are statistically more likely to agree to a larger, more extreme request, later to avoid the psychological discomfort of being inconsistent. It started at the perimeter. "We need scouts by the Western Ridge," Madara suggested during a council meeting. It was reasonable, sensible. No one objected. Yes. A week later, "Let me sit in on the treaty talks with the smaller surrounding clans, just to observe and ensure our history isn't forgotten." Yes. Then, "Perhaps I could speak on behalf of the younger clans, translate their concerns so Hashirama isn't overwhelmed." Yes. He wasn't commanding, he was proposing. He was framing his climb to power as an act of service. He let the elders and Hashirama arrive at his ideas as if they were their own. He was building a road of small agreements that led to a destination only he could see. Even Izuna, who noticed the twitch of a finger a mile away, seemed blinded by the momentum of the yes. But one night, as the moon hung like a silver sickle over the camp, Izuna leaned over the embers of their fire. "Do you still talk like you used to?" Izuna whispered. "Or do you only speak like a leader now?" Madara didn't answer immediately. He looked at the flickering light across his brother's face, noting the new lines of weariness around his eyes. "Does it feel like I've stopped?" Madara asked softly. Izuna said nothing. That was the trick of the yes ladder. It didn't require confrontation. It just needed quiet, habitual agreement. When Hashirama suggested a festival to celebrate the founding of the village, Konoha, the room was filled with cheers. Men who had spent 20 years in the mud wanted to dance, but Madara saw an opportunity to use the contrast principle. He waited for the excitement to peak, then he lowered his voice, injecting it with a heavy, artificial weight of burdened wisdom. "If we teach our children to dance before they learn to stand guard," Madara asked the room, "what will they become when the next threat arrives? Peace is a gift, but complacency is a death sentence." The room went cold. The imagery of dead children was a pattern interrupt that shattered the joy of the festival. By framing a celebration as a lack of protection, he made the supporters of the festival feel irresponsible. The festival was postponed. Madara didn't issue an order. He simply planted a doubt so poisonous that the others felt they had chosen to cancel it themselves. Madara began to walk through the newly marked village lines alone. He was the architect, but he was becoming a ghost in his own design. He used persuasion, setting the stage for future control by constantly reminding the Uchiha that they were different and necessary for the village's survival. He was planting the idea that while Hashirama was the heart of Konoha, the Uchiha were its bones. And bones are cold. Bones are hard. Bones are what remain when the heart stops beating. One evening, a younger cousin pulled him aside. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You saw the village before the first stone was laid." Madara didn't deny it. He just said, "Some stones roll faster downhill than others." He was creating an aura of infallibility. If people believe you can see the future, they stop trying to change it. They simply wait for you to tell them what happens next. But the architecture of the yes ladder has one fatal flaw. It only works as long as the ladder holds. Madara had spent months building a structure of influence, layering agreement upon agreement. He had Hashirama's trust. He had the Uchiha's loyalty. He had the illusion of a peaceful future. But in the dark corners of the Senju compound, Tobirama was sharpening a different kind of tool, Tobirama didn't believe in the yes. He believed in the no. He was preparing a technique, a literal and metaphorical countermove that was designed specifically to kill the momentum of the Uchiha. As Madara stood on the ridge looking down at Izuna, he felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. He realized that for all his manipulation, for all his yeses, there was one person he hadn't fully accounted for: his brother. Izuna was the only one who still saw the boy who skipped stones. He was the only one whose no could actually shatter Madara's world. And in the distance, the Senju were preparing for one final skirmish before the village was officially inaugurated, a mission that was supposed to be a formality. Madara didn't know that the next time he saw the Naka River, it wouldn't be for a secret meeting or a skipping stone. He didn't know that Tobirama had finished his research on a new teleportation-based jutsu, the Flying Raijin. And he didn't know that the yes ladder he had built was about to be kicked out from under him, leaving him dangling over a void of grief that would finally, irrevocably, unlock the ultimate power of his bloodline. The peace was a lie, the village was a cage, and the cost of Madara's control was about to be paid in the only currency he had left to give: his brother's life. But before the blade falls, we must look at the final conversation between the two brothers, the one where Izuna finally stopped saying yes. By the time Madara turned 18, Konoha had begun to resemble the dream it was built on. It had a name, borders that were respected, and allies that sent envoys instead of assassins. Children from rival clans now trained in shared academies, their laughter echoing off the same walls that used to be guarded by sentries. The smell of smoke no longer triggered a leap for a kunai. It simply meant dinner was being prepared. From a distance, it looked like peace had finally taken root. But Madara was not a man who lived in the distance. He lived in the architecture of reality, and he knew that peace was often just a stage set over rot. He felt the rot in the way the newly formed council deferred to Hashirama's exhausting optimism. He felt it in the way Senju patrols were expanding deeper into the Fire Country's vital arteries under the pretense of shared security. Most of all, he felt it in Tobirama. Hashirama's brother didn't look at the Uchiha with hatred anymore. He looked at them with the clinical detachment of a mathematician solving an equation. Tobirama wasn't waiting for a fight, he was waiting for a justification. Madara didn't trust the Senju's protocol of unity. Where Hashirama saw dreams, Tobirama saw vulnerabilities to be catalogued. When the proposal for joint patrols was raised in the high-ceilinged council chambers, Madara's voice was the only one that didn't harmonize with the chorus of agreement. "The peace is too young," Madara said, his eyes scanning the room. "A single mistake, a single misinterpreted gesture in the field could undo everything we've bled for." Hashirama, ever the heart of the village, stepped forward and clasped Madara's shoulder. His grip was warm, heavy, and full of a sincerity that Madara found increasingly suffocating. "That's exactly why we must do this, Madara. We can't just trust in words. We must trust in action. We must bleed together so we don't have to bleed against each other." It was the perfect idealist's trap. To refuse was to admit you didn't want peace. To agree was to walk into a cage. Izuna was the one who broke the deadlock. "We can't keep refusing joint operations, brother. It makes us look paranoid. It makes the Uchiha look like the only ones still living in the past." Madara's jaw clenched so tight, the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. "It's not paranoia if the terrain is exposed, Izuna. If the objective is vague and Tobirama is the one drafting the maps, it's a suicide walk." Izuna smiled, that same soft, confident smile that had survived 1,000 battles. He wasn't being defiant. He just still believed that the world could be reasoned with. "Then let me go. I trust my own eyes more than I fear his maps. If I am there, the Uchiha are represented. If I am there, you have a witness." The room was watching. The yes ladder Madara had built in previous months now had a new rung, and he was being forced to climb it. He nodded. It was the heaviest movement of his life. The mission was supposed to be a formality, a joint sweep through the lower river valleys to mark trade paths and clear out remnant bandit camps. A show of unity, one Uchiha team, one Senju team. But on the third day, the world collapsed. The ambush didn't come from a rival clan or a bandit king. It was fast, clean, and terrifyingly professional. The attackers were masked, using silent killing techniques that left no room for negotiation. The formation split the joint patrol neatly, separating the Senju from the Uchiha in a way that felt less like luck and more like a choreographed dance. Izuna took the front line. That was his nature, the first to move, the last to retreat. He was the shield of the clan. Witnesses later said he shielded a younger Nara soldier from a kunai barrage that would have shredded him. They said he countered a high-level water-style jutsu with a flare of Uchiha fire that lit up the valley like a second sun. He fought like a man who had already accepted his end. By the time Madara reached the valley, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and iron. He found Izuna on the ground. His brother was pale, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that whistled through a punctured lung. The medical nin were panicking. Their hands were glowing green with healing chakra, but the blood wouldn't stop. Madara dropped to his knees, his own hands shaking as he tried to force his chakra into the wound. But it was useless. Izuna's chakra was slipping away, repelled by his own body like oil on water. Izuna's hand, cold and slick with blood, found Madara's wrist. "Don't let them take it from you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Not the fire, not the reason we fought." Then the hand fell away. In that moment, Madara didn't just lose a brother, he lost his last tether to empathy. In dark psychology, a martyr's death is the ultimate tool for radicalization. It creates a moral debt that can never be repaid. Madara no longer saw the Senju as allies, he saw them as debtors whose currency was blood. The funeral was held 3 days later under a sky that stayed gray but refused to rain. The procession was a study in Uchiha stoicism, silent, rigid, and cold. Madara didn't speak a single word. Neither did Tobirama, who stood on the opposite side of the clearing, his face a mask of stone. Hashirama spoke of honor, sacrifice, and the cost of peace. But to Madara, the words sounded like they were written in a language he no longer spoke. They were empty calories for a starving man. No inquiry was launched, no culprits were found. The attack was officially labeled unfortunate, the work of radicals who opposed the village. The language was designed to soothe, to sweep the blood under the rug of the great dream. When Hashirama met Madara's eyes afterward and said, "We'll make sure it never happens again," he didn't realize he had just confirmed Madara's darkest suspicion. Hashirama didn't say, "I will find out who did this." He said, "We will move on." To Madara, moving on was the ultimate betrayal. That night, Madara stood in front of Izuna's empty bunk. A single blue scarf hung from the bedpost, a joke Izuna had once used to mock the stuffy aristocratic customs of the Elder Council. Madara stared at it until his eyes burned. He didn't touch it. He didn't cry. Instead, he walked into the village. He didn't go to grieve. He went to observe. He watched how quickly the gears of Konoha resumed their grinding. He saw laughter in the training yards. He saw council meetings filled with talk of trade routes and budgets. He saw Tobirama, calm and composed, providing tactical advice as if he hadn't walked out of the same valley where Izuna had died. Madara realized that the village didn't care about the Uchiha's loss. It cared about its own stability. So he changed his strategy. He performed a cold-blooded pivot. He stopped fighting the council and started defining it. At the next meeting, Madara didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He suggested a minor shift in defensive scouting patterns. It was a technicality buried in pages of fluff. No one opposed him. They felt sorry for him. They thought he was throwing himself into work to drown his grief. But afterward, when an elder tried to pull him aside to discuss his tone, Madara simply looked at him. One glance. The Sharingan didn't even spin, but the weight of the malice behind his eyes was enough to make the man's heart skip a beat. That elder didn't sleep for 3 nights. Madara was no longer using the yes ladder. He was using dominance through precision. He began rewriting village policy, reallocating authority, and using old, obscure regulations to create a new kind of obedience. He no longer asked for permission. He simply acted as if permission were an irrelevant concept. He understood the dark truth now. When the last person who believes in your goodness dies, the people who doubt your power don't stand a chance. Izuna had been the voice that softened him, the reason to hesitate, the reason to believe that a skipping stone was better than a kunai. But Izuna was gone, and in his place was a man who understood that vision without vigilance is just a fantasy. Trust without power is a waiting knife, and sincerity was never a strategy. It was only leverage for those too weak to take what they wanted. Madara was sharpening himself in the dark. He was preparing the Uchiha for a future where they wouldn't be part of a village. They would be its masters, or its end. But as he sat in the moonlight, staring at his own hands, he realized his eyes were changing. The grief wasn't just in his heart. It was transforming his biology. A new pattern was forming in his pupils, a spinning, cursed geometry that promised the power to rewrite reality itself. The Mangekyo Sharingan had awakened, and with it came a hunger that peace could never satisfy. Because Madara was no longer looking for a village. He was looking for a way to bring his brother back, even if he had to set the entire world on fire. The frost came early that year. By the time Madara turned 19, the air in Konoha had changed. It wasn't a violent shift, nor was it an open one. It was perceptible only to those who lived in the shadows of the dream, like the subtle, heavy stillness in the air before the first flake of a catastrophic blizzard lands. You could feel it in the long, hollow pauses between council meetings. You could see it in the quick, nervous glances traded across market stalls when an Uchiha walked by. Conversations would end a beat too early, the laughter dying in the throat as if suppressed by a sudden lack of oxygen. It had been months since Izuna's death. The world had kept turning, spinning forward with a relentless, cruel momentum. But Madara had not turned with it. He remained anchored in that blood-stained valley, a ghost haunting a village that was already trying to forget its own foundation. Konoha flourished on the surface. Roads were paved with white stone. Trade routes stabilized, bringing silk from the east and iron from the north. The mission board was constantly filled with safe, high-paying assignments. The academy even expanded its curriculum beyond the blade, teaching diplomacy, forestry, and poetry. A festival had been approved, rescheduled, and this time it was actually held. Lanterns glowed like grounded stars along the streets. But Madara watched it all with the cold, mechanical precision of an engineer measuring the exact rate at which a dam begins to crack. He knew that a structure built on a lie cannot be saved by a coat of paint. Hashirama still spoke of unity. He still smiled with a belief so radiant it felt contagious to the weak-minded. He would place a heavy, warm hand on Madara's shoulder as if that simple touch could restore the world to what it was before the river ran red. But trust, once broken, doesn't return with sentiment. It returns with proof. And in the hidden corridors of power, there was no proof of equality, only proof of management. Tobirama's influence had grown. It wasn't boastful or loud, it was structural. It was woven into the very fabric of the village's legal code. New patrol routes, new protocols, quiet initiatives with names like internal threat assessments and clan movement logs. On paper, these were neutral, administrative necessities, but in practice, they acted as a magnifying glass held over the Uchiha compound. Madara saw it all. He saw the way the Senju were positioned at every logistical throatbolt of the village. He said little. Instead, he began to act. At council meetings, Madara became a master of the trap question. He never accused the Senju of bias. That would make him look defensive. Instead, he posed ideas that sounded like reasonable suggestions, but functioned like a psychological pincer movement. Would it ease the burden on the central command? Madara asked during a session on village defense. If the Uchiha managed their own internal security? Not as a move toward isolation, but as a gesture of autonomy and trust? The room went silent. This was the double bind. If the council said yes, they were officially validating the separation of the Uchiha, moving one step closer to the segregation Madara predicted. If they said no, they were effectively admitting that they did not trust the Uchiha to govern themselves, confirming they were subjects, not equals. Whichever choice the village made, the outcome affirmed Madara's worldview. The dream was never built for him. It was built for those who were willing to be managed. Hashirama noticed the shift. He felt the cold radiation coming off Madara, a frost that no amount of optimism could melt. One evening, long after the sun had dipped below the charcoal ridgelines and the village lay in the quiet glow of lanterns, Hashirama visited. No guards, no formal summons, just two men sitting on the edge of the high compound wall, looking down at the village they had bled to create. Madara didn't offer tea. Hashirama didn't expect any. "You've changed, Madara," Hashirama said softly, his voice barely rising above the wind. Madara didn't look at him. He watched a single leaf spiral down toward the dark streets. People say that like it's a tragedy, like it's unnatural to grow harder when the world tries to break you. "I don't mean it as an attack," Hashirama countered. "You never do. That's the problem, Hashirama. You wrap your iron in silk and wonder why I still feel the weight." Hashirama sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "I want this to work. I want us to lead this village together, truly together." Madara finally turned his head. His eyes weren't the Sharingan, just the deep obsidian black of his youth, but they were sharper than any blade. "Then stop asking me to follow. You speak of leading together, but every time there is a disagreement, the unity of the village just happens to align with the Senju's vision. That isn't leadership. That is a slow-motion surrender." A heavy, real silence fell between them. It was the silence of two people realizing they were speaking different languages. "Tell me what you need," Hashirama said, his voice desperate. "Whatever it is, I'll do it." Madara studied him, looking for a flicker of the boy he once knew. "I need to know that if the roles were reversed, if it were Tobirama's people being watched, being logged, being sidelined in the academy, you'd still be this calm. I need to know you'd tell him to sacrifice for the dream as easily as you tell me." Hashirama opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't answer, because they both knew that Tobirama would never allow it, and Hashirama would never demand it of him. "You can't answer," Madara whispered, "because you know the truth. Your peace is only peace because it costs you nothing. It is paid for in Uchiha silence." Hashirama looked away, staring at the distant forest. Madara let that silence linger. He let it become the answer. "In dark psychology, this is weaponized silence. By refusing to fill the void, Madara forced Hashirama to sit with his own hypocrisy until it became unbearable. The next day, the council convened to discuss a village-wide census and registry. It was framed as logistics, a harmless way to manage resource allocation and medical records, a common-sense administrative step. Madara listened. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded. When the vote was called, he raised his hand in support. Then, as the clerk began to record the result, he spoke. "I assume," Madara said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "that this registry applies to the hidden archives as well? That all clans, including the Senju leadership, are being asked to provide the same level of granular detail regarding their internal chakra techniques and birth lineages." The room fell into a sudden, icy stillness. It wasn't outrage. It was the sound of a secret being named. If they said yes, they would expose the Senju's closely guarded secrets. If they said no, they were admitting the registry was a tool for surveillance, not logistics. No one answered. There was no safe answer. Later that afternoon, Madara walked past the academy. He stood by the fence, watching the children laugh. Uchiha, Senju, Sarutobi, Nara, they were running together, blissfully unaware that they were inheriting a system already splitting at the seams. He watched them for a long time. He felt a flicker of the old dream, the one he and Hashirama had shared. But then he remembered Izuna's pale face in the valley. He remembered the registry. He remembered the double binds that were being woven around his people. He turned away. Unity built on denial was just another form of control, a softer cage, but a cage nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, more proposals would pass. More boundaries would be drawn. None of them were explicitly anti-Uchiha, but all of them pushed the line just a few inches further, and Madara never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He had planted the question, and now the question was eating the village from the inside out. Madara was no longer trying to fix the village. He was preparing to transcend it. He was beginning to look beyond the walls of Konoha toward a solution that didn't require the permission of a council or the kindness of a friend. He was beginning to see the world as a scripted play, and himself as the only one who had realized the stage was on fire. But as the frost thickened on the windows of the Uchiha compound, a new shadow was beginning to move in the darkness. Not a Senju, not an ally. Something older, something that had been waiting for a man with Madara's specific brand of grief to finally lose his faith in the world of men. By the time the first sakura trees bloomed in the 20th spring of Madara's life, the village had already begun to rot from within. The rot wasn't visible to the naked eye. Children still raced each other down the training fields, their laughter ringing out in the crisp morning air. Merchants still haggled over the price of rice in the central square, and the comforting scent of hot dumplings still drifted from the corner stall near the eastern gate. But beneath this curated illusion of harmony, something fundamental had shifted. Madara could feel it in the marrow of his bones. He felt it in the hollow pauses between council meetings, where the air grew thin with unspoken words. He felt it in the clinical language of new laws, where the word security had begun to replace trust. It had been nearly a year since Izuna's death. The silence that followed his brother's passing had become its own kind of violence, a cold, expanding void that no amount of village festivals could fill. Hashirama, ever the optimist, tried to bridge the distance. He invited Madara on a walk through the forest outskirts, a path they had trodden 1,000 times as boys. The trees here had grown tall and sturdy, planted in the hopeful weeks following the Great Treaty. Hashirama viewed them as a living monument to their joint achievement. Madara walked beside him, but his footsteps no longer echoed Hashirama's pace. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gravity. "I'm worried, Madara." Hashirama admitted, his voice barely a murmur against the rustle of leaves. Not about external wars. I'm worried about us, about what we are becoming. Madara stopped, his gaze fixed on a distant ridge. And what exactly are we becoming, Hashirama? Separate, Hashirama said, the word hanging heavy in the air. Divided. I see the way the Uchiha look at the council, like they are being judged. I hear the way Tobirama talks about oversight and transparency. None of this feels shared anymore. It feels like we are two nations living in the same house, waiting for the other to blink. Madara ran a hand across the rough bark of a nearby oak. You planted these hoping they'd grow straight toward the light, but if the roots were cracked when you buried them, the tree won't last long. Hashirama tried to smile, that old, desperate warmth flickering in his eyes. Then we fix the roots, together. Madara nodded, but his heart was a cold stone. He wasn't here to fix roots anymore. He was here to shape the inevitable collapse. The first major move came when Tobirama introduced the village census. On the surface, it was presented as a harmless administrative necessity, a way to ensure the safety of all citizens by creating accurate registries of clan members, their residences, and their specialized jutsu. In the past, Madara might have fought this. He might have roared about Uchiha privacy and the sanctity of their secrets. But he had learned a more lethal tactic. He employed the Trojan agreement. Resistance invites scrutiny. It marks you as a problem to be solved, but agreement invites trust. It makes you a partner in your own surveillance until you own the process. Of course, Madara said calmly during the council vote, his voice the picture of civic duty. We support the registry. However, to ensure absolute accuracy, the clan leaders must be the ones to personally verify and submit each entry. After all, who better to protect the village from error than the ones with the most to lose? It was logical. It was fair. It was impossible to reject without admitting the council didn't trust the clan leaders. By saying yes, Madara ensured that every piece of data regarding the Uchiha passed through his hands first. He wasn't being registered. He was building the database. He turned a tool of surveillance into a tool of gatekeeping. Weeks later, Tobirama proposed that the Uchiha be reassigned to the border patrols. His reasoning was sound. The Uchiha are tactically superior. They are the perfect shield to monitor external threats. Again, Madara didn't flinch. He used the Trojan agreement once more. The Uchiha are honored to serve as the village's first line of defense, Madara stated. We ask only that our patrol routes include the western cliffs. It is sacred ground where our elders are buried, and we wish to maintain our ceremonial rites. The council granted the request instantly. They were relieved. They thought Madara was finally playing along. But with that single yes, the Uchiha were moved to the perimeter. They were out of the central village, out of the key decision-making corridors, and out of the daily sight of the other clans. Madara had successfully isolated his people, but he had done it at the council's request. He had turned their security measure into his own sovereign territory. Hashirama called for another walk, but this time the atmosphere was different. They stood near the great waterfall, the roar of the water echoing the turbulence between them. They're saying you're withdrawing, Madara, Hashirama said, his brow furrowed. That you are intentionally isolating the Uchiha from the heart of Konoha. Madara tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Is it isolation if it was voted on by your council? Is it withdrawal if it was supported by your brother's tactical recommendations? I am merely following the path the village has paved for us. Hashirama stepped closer, reaching out as if to grab a ghost. You know that's not what I meant. I miss you, the real you, the one who didn't need these masks and strategies just to speak to a friend. Madara met his gaze, and for a split second, the coldness vanished, replaced by a searing ancient pain. Then speak to me without fear, Hashirama, and ask yourself why you've started to feel that fear in the first place. You miss a boy who died in a valley a year ago? The man standing before you is the one you created. He left before Hashirama could find the words to argue. The final crack occurred at the Midsummer Council. A Senju elder, emboldened by the recent cooperation, proposed a law requiring all clan scrolls to be submitted for archival review to ensure village safety and the standardization of jutsu. Madara stood up. The room held its breath, expecting an explosion. Instead, he spoke with a terrifying, even tone. A wise proposal. Knowledge is the bedrock of peace. We shall submit our scrolls, provided we start with the records from the First War. Specifically, the scrolls detailing the Senju's secret assassination techniques used before the peace accords. The elder turned ashen. Those scrolls contained the darkest secrets of the Senju's rise to power. Those are sensitive historical documents, he stammered. Madara nodded slowly. So are ours. And if we are one village, history must be shared equally. Shouldn't it? The proposal was tabled and never spoken of again, but the message had been sent with surgical precision. Nothing was equal. The dream was a hierarchy, and the Uchiha were at the bottom. By autumn, Madara was gone, and only he knew where. But he didn't need to speak to the council anymore. His influence was spreading through the Uchiha compound, like an infection. Younger Uchiha began echoing his calculated phrases, turning them into a new doctrine. Security is earned, never given. Proximity to the Senju is not unity with the Senju. True protection begins with our own separation. Madara hadn't ordered them to say these things. He had simply made the ideas available through his actions and his agreements. In dark psychology, this is known as social proofing. If the leader accepts a situation but frames it with a specific subtext, the followers will adopt that subtext as their own reality. As Hashirama stood alone on the cliffside one night, watching the border fires flicker like distant angry stars, Tobirama approached him from the shadows. "You know what has to happen now," Tobirama said, his voice as cold as the coming winter. Hashirama didn't respond. He knew his brother was right. He knew the yeses Madara had given were more dangerous than any no could have been. The cracks in the village were no longer just flaws in the stone. They had become paths leading away from the light. Beyond the torches of the compound, Madara walked alone. He wasn't angry. He wasn't grieving. He was possessed by a terrifying certainty. He had tested the dream, and it had shattered under the weight of its own hypocrisy. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Every agreement, every patrol route, and every silent gaze was a piece of a larger puzzle. The diplomacy of men had failed. Now it was time for the diplomacy of the gods. Madara was about to execute a plan that would make the village look like a sandbox in the eyes of a giant. But to do it, he would have to face the one man he still loved, and the one man he would have to kill to set his clan free. The leaves had begun to turn again, deep bruised reds and brittle browns cloaking the edges of Konoha as late autumn settled in with a biting chill. Below the cliffs, the village looked like a sanctuary. Children still raced through the courtyards, their wooden kunai clattering against stone. Merchants still haggled over the price of winter silks. On the surface, the dream was thriving, but beneath the soil the roots were screaming. A patrol near the northern border had found a message carved into the bedrock, not a threat, just the Uchiha crest, scorched into the stone with Amaterasu flames that refused to go out. Rumors began to bleed through the border towns like ink in water. A shadow seen at the edge of the tree line, a voice in the wind that sounded like grinding metal. Madara. He was supposed to not be a threat. Since his quiet resignation, the Uchiha had become ghosts within their own walls. Tobirama had met this silence with more paper, more registries, more curfews, more civilian safety protocols. Hashirama had tried to stop it, reaching out into the dark for a friend who no longer existed. But the silence on the other end of those meetings was louder than any war drum. And then, one night, the sky didn't just turn dark. It burned. There was no army, no trumpets, just a sudden, suffocating pressure in the air, the kind of chakra that makes your lungs forget how to expand. Then came the roar. The Nine Tails, Kurama, descended upon Konoha like an earthquake wrapped in orange fur and ancient hatred. His eyes were not his own. They were mirrors reflecting the jagged, spinning geometry of Madara's Mangekyo. Every swing of a tail leveled a district. Every breath turned a street into a furnace. Panic didn't just spread, it shattered the village's soul. Shinobi scrambled into formations that felt useless. Tobirama barked orders through the smoke. Hashirama leapt from the Hokage stone, his heart breaking before the first blow was even struck. And there, standing atop the great fox, was Madara. He wasn't dressed as a general. He was dressed in the high-collared battle armor of the warring states, a walking relic of the blood they had tried to wash away. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was the final statement. This village was built on the ashes of compromise, and today the fire returns. Madara didn't target the civilians. He didn't care for the merchants or the children. He cut a path of absolute destruction directly toward the one man who represented the lie. Hashirama met him at the border, a massive natural ravine once untouched by man, now destined to become a tomb. There, in the thunderous roar of the waterfall, beneath trees as old as the earth itself, the gods of the shinobi world collided. The battle didn't just split the ground, it rearranged the map of the land of fire. Hashirama summoned wood dragons that groaned like old oak trees in the wind. Madara countered with a Susanoo so vast it draped over the Nine Tails like a suit of samurai armor, a demon god of blue light and orange fire. Chakra tore through stone until mountains became dust. The river turned to mist. The sky turned to a bruised electric purple. But beneath the world-ending strikes was a silence that only two friends could share, a question neither could ask aloud. How did we let the dream become this? In a rare moment of stillness, as the rubble settled and their breath came in ragged, bloody gasps, Hashirama stepped forward through the smoke. "Madara, let go of this!" he cried, his voice cracking. "Come home. We can still fix the roots. We can still make it right." Madara looked at him through a mask of blood and dust. "Home?" he repeated, the word tasting like poison. "The one where my people are catalogued like inventory? Where we are watched from the shadows of the very towers we helped build? Where our loyalty is measured only by how much of our soul we surrender?" Hashirama hesitated. He looked away, because he knew the truth, and Madara saw the hesitation for what it was, the final betrayal. In this moment, Madara was facing the ultimate false choice. It is a technique used by systems of power to force compliance. Option 1. Return. Accept the peace of the village and be slowly erased, watched and caged until the Uchiha name is a footnote. Option 2. Resist. Become the villain, the monster, and ensure your legacy is written in blood. Either way, the system wins. If he returns, he is controlled. If he fights, he justifies the system's need for more security. So Madara chose a third option, one they never saw coming. He fought with a fury that forced Hashirama to his absolute limit. He pushed Hashirama to a place where the god of shinobi had to stop being a friend and start being an executioner. But all of a sudden, he let the Nine Tails be suppressed. He let his Susanoo shatter. And finally, at the edge of the water, he let Hashirama drive a blade through his back. Madara Uchiha fell. His body was cold. His heart stopped. The world watched as the great traitor was finally put down. He was buried in secret, mourned by none but the wind. The village exhaled. The threat was over. But strategic surrender is the most dangerous move a manipulator can make. When you let your enemy think they have won, they stop watching. They stop checking the shadows. They lower their guard because they believe the problem has been buried 6 feet deep. Madara hadn't died. He had used the Izanagi, a forbidden jutsu that allows the user to rewrite reality at the cost of an eye. He traded his sight for a second chance at a world that didn't know he existed. The Valley of the End became a shrine. Massive statues were carved into the cliffs, Hashirama and Madara eternally locked in a stalemate of stone. Songs were written. Children were taught the story of how the Great Fire was extinguished by the will of fire. But the legend was the biggest lie of all. Deep underground, far from the light of the sun, Madara began his real work. He didn't need an army anymore. He didn't need a council seat. He had the one thing no one else in the village possessed: absolute patience. He had turned his death into a disguise and his defeat into a method. He was no longer a man. He was a silent architect of a disaster that would take decades to bloom. He sat in the darkness, connected to the roots of the Gedo statue, watching the world through the eyes of others. The next phase of his plan wasn't about power. It was about time. The most dangerous weapon Madara ever used wasn't the Nine Tails or the Susanoo. It was the ability to wait until his enemies grew old, until their children grew complacent, and until the peace Hashirama built began to choke on its own weight. As the sun sets over the statues at the valley, the shadows they cast grow long, reaching toward a future that Madara has already scripted. He is the corpse that wasn't his. He is the myth that refuses to stay in the books. And as the lanterns of Konoha flicker out for the night, remember this: the most effective way to control a world is to make it believe you are no longer in it. The eyes are still watching. And the real battle, the one for the soul of humanity, has only just begun. 30 years had passed since the Valley of the End. Above ground, the world had moved on with the callous indifference of a river flowing over a sunken stone. The valley where the gods had clashed was no longer a fresh wound. It was a monument, a cautionary tale for academy students, a myth for travelers. The great stone faces of the Hokage watched over a Konoha that was vibrant, bustling, and willfully forgetful of the man who had helped lay its first brick. But deep beneath the roots of the world, buried under layers of silence and cold stone, a man they thought was a ghost was still thinking. Madara Uchiha's body had become a ruin. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched thin over bones that felt like brittle glass. He was no longer a warrior of grace. He was a fragment of a man, tethered to the Gedo statue by a grotesque umbilical cord of white, pulsing roots. Most days, he could barely speak above a dry, rattling whisper that sounded like dead leaves scuttling across a tomb. But Madara didn't need to walk. He didn't need to shout. Because while Konoha celebrated its decades of peace, Madara was busy rewriting the fundamental laws of reality. His most powerful tool was no longer the Susanoo. It was time. In the world of manipulation, there is no strategy more devastating than the long con. Most people manipulate for short-term gains, wealth, status, or an immediate yes. But the master manipulator understands that true control is a slow-growth crop. It is the art of forfeiting decades of comfort to engineer a single perfect ending. Madara sat in the bowels of a forgotten cavern where the stone walls glistened with an oily moisture and the air smelled of ozone and rot. A single pale glowstone flickered above him, casting long skeletal shadows. This was his tomb, and it was his throne. He had stolen a piece of Hashirama during their final battle, a mouthful of flesh that contained the Senju's life force. He had grafted it into his own wounds. It was a slow, agonizing process of biological rejection and integration. For decades, nothing happened, but Madara didn't panic. He waited. He watched his own decay with the clinical detachment of a scientist. And then, one morning, shortly before his natural life should have ended, his vision changed. It didn't just clear, it exploded. His eyes burned white, then a deep hypnotic purple. The Rinnegan had awoken, a power so rare it hadn't been seen since the era of the Sage of Six Paths. These were a god's eyes, birthed from the intersection of Uchiha vengeance and Senju vitality. Madara smiled, a jagged, terrifying sight in the dark. The world above kept sleeping, unaware that its executioner had just gained the power to pull down the moon. Madara called it the Tsuki no Me Keikaku, the Moon's Eye Plan. He had realized that Hashirama's dream of peace was a child's lullaby. It relied on the will of fire, a vague, sentimental hope that people would choose to be good. Madara knew better. He knew that as long as there is light, there will be shadows. As long as there is love, there will be the potential for hate. His solution was the ultimate act of benevolent tyranny. He would cast a genjutsu upon the moon, trapping every living soul in a permanent, perfect dream. They wouldn't choose peace. They would be incapable of knowing conflict even existed. To build this illusion, however, he needed more than a god's eyes. He needed proxies. He needed hands that could move in the light while he remained in the dark. First came Obito. It happened during a routine mission for a new generation of Konoha shinobi. A cave collapse, a crushed body, a boy left for dead beneath a mountain of stone. Madara could have let the boy's light go out. Instead, he rescued him. He nursed him with the white Zetsu cells, grafting a new body onto the broken one. But he didn't demand loyalty. He didn't brainwash him with jutsu. That would be too simple. Instead, he used orchestrated trauma. Madara didn't tell Obito the world was evil. He showed him. He waited for the perfect moment. The moment Obito's teammate, Rin, was positioned between a friend's blade and a battlefield's chaos. Madara didn't pull the trigger. He just set the stage and let the cruelty of reality do the work. When Obito witnessed the death of the girl he loved, the will of fire inside him didn't just flicker. It turned into a black hole. Madara stepped out of the shadows and asked a single leading question. If the world allows a heart like hers to be pierced, is the world worth saving? Grief did the rest. That is the secret of the long con. You don't argue with people. You simply arrange their pain until they arrive at your conclusion and believe it was their own discovery. He used a technique known as narrative reframing. He didn't argue with Obito's love for his friends. He reframed that love as the very thing that made him a victim. He waited for Obito's mind to replay the loop. Kakashi's hand, the chirping of the Chidori, the spray of blood as Rin's heart stopped. Madara let the grief do the sculpting. He positioned himself not as a teacher, but as a mirror. There is no peace, he would rasp in the dark, only perception. And if you cannot control the world, you must rewrite the perception of it. As the years dripped by, Obito's body healed, but his identity was systematically dismantled. He donned a mask, spiraled, orange, and void of expression. It wasn't just a shield, it was an act of identity displacement. "I am Madara Uchiha," Obito told the world. The lie was devastatingly effective because the world had already written Madara into legend. Delegated authority works best when the myth is more believable than the man. No one questioned the mask because they were too afraid of what it represented. And if they did, they didn't live long enough to spread the doubt. Under this name, Obito moved through the nations like a virus. He collected the discarded and the broken, shinobi like Kisame and Sasori, who were tired of the honorable lies of their villages. He built the Akatsuki. And the real Madara? Still underground, still rotting, but his reach was now continental. This is the brilliance of insulation. The more Obito acted, the more terrifying Madara became in the minds of the 5 Kage, while the real man never had to lift a finger. Decades after the Valley of the End, the fracture Madara had predicted finally reached its breaking point. The Uchiha clan, moved to the outskirts of Konoha and watched by the ANBU, were a powder keg. Madara knew that a cornered animal eventually bites. He had spent years planting the seeds of Uchiha superiority and Senju betrayal through his agents. He didn't need to be in the village to cause the riot. He had built the village to be a pressure cooker. When the order for the massacre was finally whispered in the dark corridors of the Leaf, Obito was there to facilitate it. He didn't just kill, he curated. He helped Itachi wipe out the clan, leaving only Sasuke alive. One more broken heart to be leveraged later. This was delegated authority at its most clinical. Itachi bore the guilt. Danzo bore the blood. But Madara owned the outcome. With every Uchiha that fell, the ghost of the Uchiha grew stronger, more inevitable. Around the same time Madara was manipulating Obito, he had his eyes on another puppet. Years earlier, Madara had already begun planting the seeds for his resurrection. Quietly, without a single fingerprint left behind, he had implanted his Rinnegan into a young orphan in the Hidden Rain village. He never met the boy. He didn't need to. He knew that the Hidden Rain was a land of perpetual weeping and war. He knew that a child with those eyes would eventually be broken by the world. He waited for the death of Nagato's best friend Yahiko, knowing it would be the trigger he needed. He waited for the disillusionment of the Akatsuki. Through his proxy, Obito, Madara steered Nagato toward the role of pain. He turned a grieving boy into a god who believed that peace through suffering was his own divine mission. Nagato thought he was the leader, but Obito knew better. Both were merely characters in a script Madara had written decades before they were born. Years later, Obito stood before the Rinnegan of Nagato. He believed he was the architect of the war. He believed he was the one choosing to end the world. He reached for the power, not realizing that the eyes he sought were Madara's, implanted into a child of the rain decades ago. Obito was a man who had spent his entire life wearing a dead man's face, speaking a dead man's words, and chasing a dead man's dream. "It's time," Obito whispered into the rain. But it wasn't his time. It was the moment the trap finally snapped shut. This was Madara's masterpiece, not a jutsu, but a structure, an empire built from faith, fear, and the systematic destruction of a young boy's soul. Madara had turned his own death into his greatest tactical advantage. Through these pawns, Madara began to speak to the world again, not as a man, but as an ideology. The world thought it was evolving. Great wars were fought, alliances were broken, and heroes like Minato Namikaze rose and fell. But every major shift, every tragedy, and every escalation was part of Madara's design. A whisper in the ear of a daimyo here, a strategic death there. Madara used the illusion of agency. He let Obito wear the mask and call himself Madara. He let Nagato believe he was the sage reborn. By letting others carry his name, Madara ensured that his enemies were fighting a ghost. And you cannot kill a ghost. He sat in his chair, his eyes closed, feeling the pulse of the world through the roots of the statue. He was patient. The long con doesn't rush because it doesn't fear the passage of years. It knows that the longer a lie is told, the more it resembles the truth. Madara understood a truth most leaders ignore. People forget, but systems remember. Most men try to preserve their power by passing it to a successor. Madara preserved his by programming the world around him. This is legacy engineering. It is the art of embedding your will so deeply into the structure of a society or the mind of a proxy that it can no longer be uprooted. To do this, Madara finalized the layers of the Moon's Eye plan, its illusions, its fail-safes, and its necessary sacrifices. Then, using the last dregs of his chakra, he embedded a hidden resurrection clause within the Rinnegan he had given to Nagato. He passed the final scroll to Obito with brittle fingers. "They'll think you're me," Madara rasped, a ghost of a smirk on his lips. "That's fine. Let them. A name is just a tool. Never forget, the story is already written. You are just turning the pages." Then he let go. He didn't let go of the plan. He just let go of the need to watch it happen. Nagato never met Madara. He never heard the rasp of his voice or saw the hypnotic spin of his eyes. And yet, every choice Nagato made, every drop of blood he spilled in the hidden rain, every speech he gave about the cycle of pain, was in service to a man he didn't know existed. This is the true horror of legacy engineering, when your influence survives not in memory, but in instinct. Nagato believed his pain was his own. He believed Yahiko's death was an accident of a cruel world. He believed the identity of pain was his own divine creation. He didn't realize that from the moment the Rinnegan bloomed in his childhood eyes, he was a tethered puppet dancing on invisible strings. The ideology of peace through pain wasn't Nagato's discovery. It was a borrowed philosophy planted by Obito, whose own words had been rehearsed in a cave 30 years prior. Nagato thought he was breaking the cycle. In reality, he was just the mechanism that triggered the next phase of Madara's design. Decades had turned the boy Obito into a man of shadows. He no longer questioned the Moon's Eye plan. He recited it like scripture. He had become fluent in a language Madara created. Each word he spoke was a line from a script written before he was born. But beneath the bravado, something twisted began to happen. Obito began to believe it was his plan. He began to feel that the name Madara wasn't just a title. It was a mantle he had earned through his own suffering. He manipulated the Akatsuki, wove conflict through the nations like a loom of war, and faced his former comrades with a conviction that was both sincere and second-hand. What he didn't realize was that even his delusion of grandeur had been predicted. Legacy engineering doesn't require loyalty. It only requires momentum. You make the next generation think they are innovating when all they are doing is unrolling your carpet. Obito was a marionette who had spent so long in the dark that he'd forgotten what strings felt like. He thought he'd become the puppeteer. Madara didn't hate the people he manipulated. In his own twisted way, he believed he was saving them. He believed that the only way to protect a heart was to put it in a dream where it could never be broken again. Hashirama had once said, "If we just try hard enough, we can change the future." Madara didn't disagree. He had changed the future. He had bent it, shaped it, and forged it into a cage that looked like a paradise. He had changed the future one lie, one trauma, and one century at a time. But as the final pieces of the Moon's Eye plan began to fall into place, as the Akatsuki gathered the tailed beasts and the world raced toward a fourth great ninja war, a new variable appeared. A boy named Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto was the living embodiment of Hashirama's failed dream. He was loud, clumsy, and irritatingly sincere. But he had something Madara hadn't accounted for, a heart that refused to be leveraged by pain. Madara watched through the White Zetsu network. He saw the way Naruto turned enemies into allies, not through manipulation, but through an agonizing, raw honesty. The question was no longer about power. It was a psychological war. Can someone trained to see through every lie, the man who invented the long con, be blinded by a force as simple and foolish as hope? The stage is set. The moon is rising. The masked man is about to declare war on the world in Madara's name. But before the final curtain falls, we must see what happens when the architect finally steps out of the shadows to claim the world he has been building in the dark. Will the world embrace the dream, or will the dreamer finally wake up to a reality he can no longer control? Amid all of the fighting against the Akatsuki, the battles against Pain, Kisame, Deidara, and the others, the world becomes focused on trying to save the Jinchuriki like Naruto, and they think they're winning. But they don't know that the real threat is a prophecy written in a cave 30 years ago. The dead man is about to stand up, and as the moon begins to turn red, we must look at the final piece of the puzzle. What happens when the puppet realizes the strings are actually made of his own memories? The resurrection is coming, and with it, the final lesson in what happens when you try to control a world that no longer wants to be saved. The sky was the wrong color. Chakra storms flickered across the shattered plains like the nervous system pulses of a dying god. Ash drifted sideways, coating the cracked earth in a layer of gray silence. The battlefield groaned beneath the weight of too many fallen names, names of shinobi who had believed this war was about nations, only to realize it was about a ghost. And somewhere between a scream and a silence, roughly 55 years after the battle at the Valley of the End, the ghost stepped into the light. A summoning circle pulsed in faint blood-red light, like a heartbeat forced into stone. Then came the breath. It didn't come from lungs, but from memory. From the smoke of the Fourth Great Shinobi War, something older than fire stepped through. Madara Uchiha had re-entered the world. Initially, his body moved like smoke given purpose, reanimated by the Edo Tensei, untouched by time, death, or even gravity. His cloak didn't flutter, it hovered. His eyes didn't blink, they judged. This war had not been his idea, but as he looked across the horizon at the Allied forces, it was clear that the stage had been meticulously set for his return. The world was woefully, tragically unprepared. They came at him fast, the 5 Kage, each carrying the weight of a country on their shoulders, legends sharpened by decades of legacy. When they moved, mountains were supposed to follow. But Madara didn't move to meet them. He measured them. His reanimated body cut through their combined assault like a razor through silk. He wasn't just fighting, he was dismantling the very concept of their authority. Every strike was a dominance assertion. "You call this resistance?" he asked, his voice low and untouched by the exertion of combat. "No, this is a rehearsal, and you are struggling with your lines." He didn't kill them immediately. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he disrespected them. He made their survival feel like a failure of character. This is the core of a psychological power grab. You don't seize power by merely screaming for it. You seize it by making everyone else's power look ridiculous. You don't win loyalty. You simply remove all other viable options until you are the only one left standing. The Kage weren't just fighting a man. They were drowning in a presence that made their titles feel like hollow toys. As explosions permeated the land and shinobi thought hordes of zetsus and reanimated shinobi elsewhere on the battlefield, Obito watched from behind his mask. He had worn Madara's name for decades. He had pulled the strings of the Akatsuki, whispered apocalypse into Nagato's ear, and convinced the world that he was the ghost of the Uchiha. But now, the real ghost had a voice, and it was correcting him. Obito saw how easily Madara tossed aside his other puppet, Nagato, and the seed of doubt started to grow. Madara didn't need to shout to exert control over his proxy. He only needed one line, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon. "You wore my face, Obito, but you never possessed my will." It wasn't an outburst of anger. It was a cold correction of a clerical error. And that is what made it lethal. Obito didn't shatter on the outside, but he began to crumble inward. Every command he had given, every war he had launched, suddenly felt borrowed. He was a child who had spent years scribbling his name on a masterpiece he couldn't actually read. The battlefield began to tilt. It didn't matter what Obito said or what the Kage did. The gravity of the world had shifted toward the original architect. This is how power works in its darkest form. It arrives with a silence so profound that it makes everyone else's voice sound imaginary. Then came the friction. The Edo Tensei, the reanimation jutsu, had rules. Ironically, that jutsu that brought the dead back to life was created by Tobirama decades before, and a shinobi named Kabuto had perfected it. He had leveraged it, and it was how Madara was able to be brought back. But of course he had planned for this. It kept the dead on a leash, a tether pulled taut by Kabuto, the snake who fancied himself a puppeteer. Madara felt the invisible collar tightening around his chakra. It was a reminder from the universe. You are not in control. Madara smiled. For the first time in over half a century, he felt the spark of resistance. He welcomed it. Control wasn't something Madara accepted from others. It was something he demanded. He reached inward, not to his soul, but to a psychological and biological trigger he had planted years ago. He activated the final phase of his plan, utilizing the connection he held to the Rinnegan. Like an equation solving itself from the inside out, he shattered the contract of the Edo Tensei. His cells began to regenerate. His heartbeat roared back into a steady, predatory rhythm. Bones realigned with sickening cracks. Chakra surged, not as a borrowed energy, but as a tidal wave of his own making. This wasn't a mere resurrection. It was a full revival. He was back, and stronger than ever. "To rule this world," he said, stepping out of the dust, fully reborn and breathing the cold air of the battlefield. "I needed no permission. I only needed timing." The KJ fell back in a wave of instinctive terror. Obito's influence vanished like mist in a gale. The war paused, not because of a strategic ceasefire, but out of pure, unadulterated awe. This was no longer a ghost or a puppet. This was the architect, the god who had used death itself as a doorway. Kabuto, for all his scheming, had been nothing but a stepping stone. Obito had been a mere prelude. Madara hadn't just returned to the fight, he had taken control of the narrative. In the theater of dark psychology, power that is handed to you can always be revoked. But power that you demonstrate, visibly, undeniably, and through sheer force of will, is impossible to argue with. Madara did not plead for the right to lead. He made it obvious that he already did. He replaced influence with presence and turned obedience into an inevitability. The wind seemed to forget how to blow. Madara stood where gods had fallen, his shadow stretching long across the broken earth. Obito, once the man behind the mask, had become just another shadow in his wake, a footnote in a much larger story. The Kage, once the proud protectors of the global order, had become spectators in a world being reordered before their eyes. This war had begun with talk of unity, of peace, and of final endings. But now, Madara was alive, and for him, the ending was only the beginning of a much larger dream. Madara is now preparing to unveil the Infinite Tsukuyomi. It is his ultimate solution, a dream, a prison, and a sanctuary all at once. To the world, it looks like madness, but in the cold logic of Madara's mind, it is a final mercy. He is about to ask the world a chilling question. What if the freedom you fight for is the very thing that is killing you? The moon is rising and the eye is opening. Now, We will see what happens when the director finally pulls the curtain on reality itself. However, there is one fatal mistake that Madara made, and it was going to cost him. But before that, he wreaked havoc on the world. Crater Valley was no longer a geographic location, it was a scar on the surface of the earth. It was a wasteland where nations had collided, burned, and bled until the soil itself turned to charcoal. Ash hung in the air like a breath never exhaled, coating the armor of the living and the dead alike. Above, chakra storms rolled through the clouds, snarling like wolves circling a weakened herd, their thunder echoing the groans of a planet being pushed to its breaking point. At the center of the crater, the 10 tails convulsed. Obito had fallen, his dreams of being the architect shattered by his own internal contradictions. In the shadow of the beast, Black Zetsu slithered unseen through the rubble, a liquid darkness already searching for its next host. The allied shinobi forces stood stunned, their weapons lowered, watching as the monstrous mass of the Jubi writhed and shifted, a force of nature no longer bound by its previous master. And into this hollow silence, barefoot and unhurried, stepped the man who had turned death into a strategic pause. Madara Uchiha. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He walked with the terrifying composure of someone whose name had already shaped the battlefield decades before his physical body arrived. He looked at the chaos, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical eye of a builder returning to a project. What do you call a man with no equal? In time, you stop calling him a man. You call him a god. Madara didn't scream as the 10 tails engulfed him. He didn't struggle against the sheer, agonizing volume of chakra being forced into his marrow. Instead, he inhaled. The beast, massive, ancient, and screaming with the collective chakra of 1,000 years, coiled and sank into him like it had been waiting for its rightful vessel. Madara's body contorted in ways that defied biology. His bones cracked with the sound of distant thunder. His hair bleached into a blinding celestial white. His eyes didn't just change, they pulsed like solar eclipses, dark and radiant all at once. Truth-seeking orbs began to spin around him in a perfect silent orbit, a celestial alignment formed by the gravity of one man's will. The transformation wasn't grotesque in the way the shinobi expected. It was holy, but it was a grotesque kind of holy, the kind that reminds you that a god's mercy is often indistinguishable from their wrath. All around him, the shinobi paused. This wasn't the paralysis of fear. It was the paralysis of confusion. It was the biological response of a mind trying to process a reality it was never designed to perceive. They weren't looking at an enemy commander anymore. They were looking at a fundamental law of the universe, a rule that stated, quite clearly, resistance was no longer rational. This is the apex of Madara's manipulation. It isn't a manipulation of thought or emotion. It is a manipulation of truth itself. In dark psychology, when an individual commands enough raw, undeniable power, their version of reality begins to physically replace the victim's. Madara didn't need to convince the Allied forces that he had become a god. He simply was. And the world, sensing the shift in gravity, began to recalibrate around him. He stepped back into the war, not as a participant, but as its conclusion. A squad of elite shinobi, men and women who had trained their entire lives for this moment, launched a coordinated assault. Shadow clones, ceiling tags, and elemental combinations perfected over generations were hurled at him. Madara watched them. He didn't dodge. He didn't even bother to block. He simply watched with a detached curiosity. The attacks struck his skin and then simply vanished. They were absorbed, nullified, and made irrelevant by forces beyond human comprehension. It was like watching a child draw strategies in the sand before a tsunami. Naruto charged, his heart blazing with the orange fire of the Kurama. Sasuke followed, his Sharingan spinning like a storm inside a storm. For the first time in their lives, they were perfectly united in a singular purpose. And yet, Madara was always one move ahead. This wasn't a matter of speed or reflexes, it was a matter of preparation. Madara had spent nearly 100 years planning this battle, thus the others were like children trying to beat a grandmaster chess player. Madara had written the pages they were still struggling to read. He understood the mechanics of their world better than they understood their own names. Kakashi faltered. Tsunade bled. Even the fourth Raikage, a human tank who moved at the speed of lightning, found himself disarmed and dropped to his knees by a flicker of force that felt more like a decree of fate than a jutsu. The battlefield shifted tone. It wasn't a war anymore, it was an ending. Not necessarily an ending of life, but an ending of freedom. High above the carnage, Madara raised a single pale hand toward the moon. His voice did not boom across the valley. It hummed, a quiet, absolute frequency that resonated in the teeth of every person present. "It's time," he said. Roots burst from the ground like black veins, the divine tree awakening as if the planet itself were answering its master's call. Black Zetsu began the final ritual, the petals of energy unfurling toward the heavens like a blossoming nightmare. And in the eyes of some shinobi, those who had seen too much death, those who had lost brothers and sisters to the cycle of war, something else began to flicker. It wasn't terror, it was relief. This is where reality distortion hits its terrifying apex, when a leader offers a solution so final, so total, that the victims start to prefer the peace of the illusion over the freedom of the hell they've survived. Shikamaru fell silent, his strategic mind finally finding a problem it couldn't solve. Ino wept, her mind sensing the collective surrender of the field. Killer Bee stopped rhyming, the silence of the end finally catching up to him. Every breath on the field felt borrowed, every soul felt watched. "Why are they kneeling?" Sasuke hissed through clenched teeth, his knees shaking as he fought the urge to join them. Naruto didn't answer, because deep down he understood. Madara wasn't threatening them. He was offering them clarity. He was the answer to a question no one had the courage to ask. What if the burden of being free is the very thing that is killing us? This is Madara's ultimate seduction. He doesn't argue ideology. He doesn't beg for loyalty. He simply becomes the inevitability. Madara's dark psychology doesn't peak in hatred. It peaks in a terrible cold mercy, the mercy of finality. The relief of a reality you no longer need to question because you are no longer the one in charge of it. This is the God complex fully realized, not just the internal belief in one's own divinity, but the external creation of a world where it is impossible to believe anything else. He walked through the crater as the moon began to shift. Its surface shimmered, not with reflected sunlight, but with something older, something watching. A million eyes, a million dreams waiting to be born. The Infinite Tsukuyomi wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise of a better reality. Madara looked up at the sky. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. The moon reflected exactly what he had always believed, that if no one else could fix the world, then only a god could be trusted to remake it. And he was right. But his hubris was his downfall, as after all, he was but a man. He believed he had conquered truth. He believed he had escaped the cycle. He believed he was the one who had finally achieved the impossible. But beneath the perfection of his power, something ancient was beginning to stir. It wasn't a rebellion of men, and it wasn't a strategy of the Kage. It was something more dangerous than both. A will that had waited longer than even Madara could imagine. Now, Madara will discover the ultimate cost of divinity. He may have rewritten the script of the world, but he forgot to check who held the pen before him. The architect is about to find out what happens when one's pride grows too big and they forget that they are also human. Madara Uchiha had won, or so he thought. His shadow stretched across the heavens, a silhouette of absolute dominion against the crimson glow of the moon. He had become the storm, the silence, and the salvation. The 10 tails coursed through his veins, a torrential river of ancient power, while divine chakra orbited his form in spheres of absolute truth. He was a god not by title, but by demonstration, a being who had successfully rewritten the laws of existence to suit his vision of peace. And yet, even gods cast shadows. From behind him, something moved. It was a movement he did not command, a ripple in the fabric of his absolute reality. Black Zetsu, the creature Madara believed to be his own manifest will, emerged from the darkness. Zetsu had always spoken in whispers, always stood behind the velvet curtains of history, murmuring prophecies that confirmed Madara's genius. But on this night, he emerged not as a servant, but as an author. A voice, no longer submissive, sliced through the air. "You were never the end, Madara. You were just the vessel." Madara turned, and for the first time in decades, the mask of the invincible architect cracked. It wasn't a crack of arrogance or anger. It was the devastating fracture of confusion. Madara had fallen victim to a manipulation technique older than ambition itself, the invisible variable. This is a master-level psychological play where you convince your opponent they are the ultimate manipulator. You let them build the throne, you let them gather the resources, fight the wars, and take the risks. You encourage their ego, confirming their belief that they are the only ones playing the long game. Then, at the moment of their greatest triumph, you sit on the throne they built for you. Zetsu did not attack Madara with a blade or a jutsu. He pierced him with a truth that rendered his power irrelevant. His form, black as a void, slithered up Madara's spine. This wasn't a battle. It was a biological and spiritual hijacking. Madara's chakra flared, then stuttered like a dying engine. His hands, which had just leveled mountains, began to tremble. His voice, now a low, wounded growl, strained against the sudden paralysis. "What are you?" Zetsu answered without a flicker of hesitation. "I am the child of a god, and you are merely her doorway." The betrayal wasn't loud or chaotic. It was surgical. The battlefield watched in a state of existential shock as Madara, this invincible storm of war, began to convulse. His skin rippled like water under a gale. His bones cracked in unnatural, rhythmic intervals. This wasn't the throes of defeat. It was the agony of transformation. It was not death. It was possession. Inside the shell of the man who thought he had conquered time, a new force began to stir. This force wasn't born of human hate or Uchiha ideology. It was something older, hungrier, and entirely indifferent to the peace Madara had sought. Kaguya Otsutsuki, the mother of chakra, the origin of every jutsu ever whispered, the first to drink from the fruit of the divine tree. And now she was being reborn through her greatest admirer and her greatest fool. Madara tried to resist. He reached for the power of the 10 tails, for the Rinnegan, for the logic that had guided him for a century. But how do you resist a plan that was written before your clan even had a name? He had predicted every move of the 5 Kage, every strategy of Naruto and Sasuke, every variable of the war. Except this. As Kaguya's form bloomed from his own flesh, reality itself began to bend and buckle. Her eyes opened, not the Sharingan, not the Rinnegan, but the Byakugan and the Rinne Sharingan, eyes that remembered the very dawn of time. Madara, now half consumed and fading into the white abyss of her arrival, screamed. It wasn't a scream of physical pain. It was a scream of disbelief. He had rewritten reality, and still he was being overwritten. Zetsu's voice slithered across the soil, a final eulogy for Madara's ego. "You thought you were the playwright, Madara, but you were always just the ink." It was a poetic, terrifying symmetry. Madara had spent his entire life manipulating others. Obito, Nagato, Hashirama, and entire nations had bent under the weight of his charisma and his war. But he had missed the one thing that lived in his own shadow, the black thread that had whispered through the centuries. Zetsu was never Madara's tool. He was Kaguya's hand. The infinite Tsukuyomi still pulsed in the sky, its hypnotic light bathing the world. But that light no longer belonged to Madara Uchiha. It served something far colder. The technique of the invisible variable thrives on ego. When someone believes they control the entire board, they stop checking the corners. Zetsu didn't challenge Madara's plan. He fed it. He encouraged Madara to become unstoppable, knowing that the more powerful the vessel became, the more perfect the resurrection would be. The deadliest betrayal is the one the victim believes is impossible. For Madara, the idea that his own will could betray him was a logical zero. The betrayal lands like a funeral for logic. Madara's expression, pure devastation, wasn't just from the loss of his life, but from the revelation that his entire existence had been a detour in someone else's journey. The war wasn't his war. The world he tried to fix was merely a page in a chapter he didn't write. His body became nothing more than scaffolding for a goddess who didn't know his name. His ideology was stripped of its purpose. The battlefield fell to its knees, not in loyalty to the new queen, but in a state of existential dread. The contrast was haunting. Madara had been elegant, even in his brutality. He believed in a forced peace. Kaguya was indifferent. She believed in a natural order where all chakra simply belonged to her. Madara was a man who had climbed the mountain to become a god. Kaguya was the mountain itself. The lesson is chilling in its precision. Even the greatest masterminds are pawns if they ignore the shadow that never speaks. The ally who is too loyal, the whisper you start to ignore, and the variable you deem impossible are the things that eventually dismantle you. Madara built a new world, but Zetsu had installed a back door before the foundation was even poured. As Kaguya rose in her full, terrifying form, Madara's presence didn't vanish in a flame or a final stand. It vanished in silence. A silence that echoed with a final, crushing truth. No matter how divine your plan, if you forget who is holding the pen, you are not the author. You are a footnote. The battlefield is pale with the light of a moon that no longer belongs to men. The divine tree pulses like a heartbeat, ready to harvest the dreams of the world. And Kaguya floats above it all, face serene, power infinite, her gaze fixed on a horizon that Madara Uchiha will never see. Deep beneath the layers of chakra and stolen divinity, the ghost of the Uchiha is finally forced to watch. Not as a god, not as a leader, but as a lesson in the ultimate cost of an unchecked ego. The world is no longer fighting for peace or for nations. It is fighting for the right to exist in a reality that isn't a harvest. And the question isn't whether the heroes can win, but whether the damage Madara's failure caused can ever be undone. Madara Uchiha lies motionless. His back is pressed into the twisted, gnarled roots of a tree that once touched the heavens, now cracked, gray, and crumbling into the dust of a broken world. These are the same roots that fed on the chakra of the living, the same roots that promised a harvest of peace. Betrayal clings to his chest like a physical weight, heavier than the blood soaking into the parched earth. His breath comes in stutters, not because he fears the void of death, but because he cannot reconcile his reality with his ending. This wasn't the plan. He had won. He had reached the summit. He had looked at the moon and seen his own reflection. And yet, here he is, reduced to a broken man in a clearing of ash. The dust has barely settled when a presence enters the crater. It isn't loud, it carries no killing intent. It is just there, like a memory that refuses to be forgotten. A flicker of chakra, ancient and familiar as the smell of wood smoke in autumn, reaches out to him. Then the voice, "Always so dramatic, Madara, even in the end." Hashirama Senju appears not as the god of shinobi, not as the first Hokage, but as a ghost carved from light and a century of regret. Madara doesn't flinch. He can't. His body is a shattered vessel held together only by a pride that hasn't yet realized the war is over. "So this is how it ends?" Madara whispers, the words catching on the iron taste of blood in his throat. Hashirama kneels beside him, his hands resting on his knees in a posture of mourning rather than victory. He says nothing at first. He doesn't need to. In the silence between them, the last 100 years play out like a haunting melody. Madara speaks for them both. "The world was broken, Hashirama. You tried to heal it with kindness, a bandage on a severed limb. I tried to heal it with vision. I gave them the truth they were too afraid to ask for." Hashirama doesn't interrupt. He lets the dying man build his final defense. "The people," Madara continues, coughing as the last of the Ten Tails' energy dissipates into the soil. "They don't want peace, not really. They want an enemy to blame for their own failures. They want a cage to keep them from their own shadows. I gave them a dream. I gave them the only perfect lie they would ever know." Still, Hashirama remains silent. That silence is the ultimate weapon. It is the refusal to validate the lie. It is the vacuum that finally cracks Madara's resolve. "Say something," Madara rasps, his eyes flashing with a final desperate spark. "Anything. Damn you, Hashirama. Tell me I was wrong. Tell me I was a monster." Hashirama sighs, a sound that carries the weight of every grave they ever dug. "What would you have me say, Madara? That you were right? That enslaving the world is a noble sacrifice? That your dream just needed one more decade of blood? You didn't save them. You just stopped them from living." This is the legacy delusion in its final stage. It is the cognitive bias where a person clings to their perceived righteousness even as the evidence turns to ash in their hands. When the world stops agreeing with the manipulator, they rewrite the history of their own intent. Madara wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of being irrelevant. He was afraid that his suffering, and the suffering he caused, would be for nothing. "I had to," he gasps, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. "No one else had the strength to carry the world." "Maybe," Hashirama replies softly. "You didn't trust the world to carry itself. Or maybe you didn't trust yourself to be just a man among men." Madara turns his head toward his old friend, his eyes dimming. "I wanted to save them, Hashirama. I truly did." "No," Hashirama says, and the truth is colder than the approaching night. "You wanted to be the one who saved them. You wanted the world to be a monument to your genius. That isn't love, Madara. That's control." The realization hits harder than the blade at the Valley of the End, because it is the ultimate psychological truth of the dictator. The save the world narrative is often just a mask for the rule the world impulse. Madara had mistaken the clouds for the ground. He thought the world would thank him for taking away its pain, never realizing that the world never asked for his intervention to begin with. The night has fully arrived now. Stars blink into being above the crater, indifferent to the fall of Titans. The air is still, no longer charged with the electric hum of divine chakra. Madara laughs, a dry, rattling sound. It isn't the laugh of a villain or a madman. It is the laugh of a man who has finally run out of stories to tell himself. "Did it matter?" he asks, his gaze drifting to the sky. "In the end, did any of it change the river's course?" Hashirama takes a long moment. He reaches out, perhaps to touch Madara's hand, perhaps just to feel the cooling air. You mattered, even if you were wrong, even if you lost everything to a shadow. You were the fire that forced the world to seek the shade. You mattered, Madara. Madara stares up at the moon. It is whole again. It is no longer a red mirror of illusions, no longer a weapon of the infinite Tsukuyomi. It is just light, cold, indifferent, and unreachable. "It's funny," he says, his voice fading to a mere thread. "I spent my whole life fearing I would die before I was proven right. Now, I think maybe it's better to die knowing I was just a man." His breath hitches. One more inhale, tasting of the earth and the wind. One more exhale, releasing the last of the Uchiha's fury. And then, stillness. His eyes stay open, fixed on the stars. Even in death, he seems to be witnessing something only he can see. Perhaps a riverbank where two boys are still throwing stones, dreaming of a world that doesn't exist. The battlefield is calm, the sky has cleared of the red haze, but the tension hasn't left the world. That is the sting of the legacy delusion. It lingers long after the heart stops beating. Madara Uchiha didn't go out as a traditional villain. He went out as a man who never stopped believing he was the hero of a story that no one else wanted to read. His vision of peace never faded. It just never belonged to anyone but himself. The earth takes him. His chakra dissipates into the soil, returning to the planet he tried to imprison. But something in the air tightens. A ripple, subtle and deep, moves through the collective consciousness of the shinobi world. Madara's legacy didn't die with him. It became the new foundation of a darker logic. Somewhere, far from the crater, another shadow is watching. Someone who studied Madara's life not to follow his footsteps, but to perfect his failures. Someone who realizes that Madara's mistake wasn't the goal, but the method. The next shadow won't ask for obedience through a dream. It will take it through reality. Madara Uchiha died a god in his own mind, but in the eyes of history, he became the ultimate warning. He was the unwilling prophet, the figure whose life teaches us that when dreams outrun empathy, they become nightmares. He was a mirror reflecting what happens when pain becomes policy and when the desire for control is mistaken for the desire for peace. The world doesn't need a savior who demands the soul of the saved. It needs the wisdom to do better than the ghosts of the past. Madara's life is over, but the question he left behind remains. If the world is broken, do you fix it with trust, or do you fix it with a cage? The answer will define the next generation as a new shadow rises from the ashes of the fallen god. The Valley of the End looks different now. 1 year has passed since the sky was unmade and the world was stitched back together. The waterfall moves with a solemn, heavy cadence, as if the land itself has gained a memory it can never quite wash away. The two statues still stand at the mouth of the ravine, though they are battered by war, cracked by lightning, and smoothed by the unrelenting spray of the river. Hashirama, Madara, the founders, the enemies, the brothers of vision who were torn apart by the execution of a dream. They stand as silent sentinels over a world that has finally stopped screaming. And beneath their stone gaze, Naruto Uzumaki and Sasuke Uchiha watch the water. They are not there to clash, and they are not there to mourn. They are there to understand. Not all ghosts wear chains, some wear ideas. And Madara Uchiha, he wore his like armor until the day it became his tomb. "Do you think he was evil?" Naruto asks, his voice barely rising above the roar of the falls. He skips a stone across the surface. It bounces 3 times before being swallowed by the current. Sasuke doesn't answer at first. His gaze is fixed on the mist curling off the riverbank like the ghost breath of a dying beast. He adjusts the cloak over his arm, his thoughts tracing the jagged lines of the history they just survived. "I think," Sasuke says finally, "that he was right, and that is exactly what made him dangerous." Madara had lost. In the physical realm, his heart had stopped, and his chakra had returned to the earth, but he had only lost in the flesh. Above the soil, the world was still debating his ghost. The old shinobi systems, the very foundations of the hidden villages, were being interrogated. The power structures he helped forge still dictated the flow of life and death. Even in the victory of the Allied forces, Madara's presence lingered. He wasn't in the council chambers or the policy meetings, yet his shadow sat at the head of every table. He had become the unwilling prophet, a tragic paradox where a person's greatest mistakes are carried forward by history because they were grand enough to survive the man who made them. Madara never set out to be a villain. He didn't want to be the monster in a child's storybook. He wanted to be the one who saw further than anyone else, the one who stood on the mountain peak while everyone else was lost in the fog of the valley. And that is why his ghost is so difficult to bury. Even now, with the war over and the moon returned to its natural light, there are whispers in the dark corners of every village. People look at the chaos of reconstruction, the difficulty of diplomacy, and the friction of freedom, and they whisper that maybe, just maybe, he had a point. Maybe peace does require a hand on the throat. Maybe freedom is the very problem that prevents harmony. Sasuke remembers the Infinite Tsukuyomi, not just the horror of the white cocoons, but the seduction of it. He remembers the way some shinobi chose to submit, not because their minds were controlled, but because their souls were exhausted. They were tired of the grief, the loss, and the endless cycle of the Naka River's bend. "When someone offers you a world without pain," Sasuke says, his voice cold and analytical, "you don't always stop to ask what the price of admission is." The sky begins to cloud over, a soft drizzle kissing the river's surface. Even the weather seems undecided, caught between the sun of the new era and the shadows of the old. Because Madara's central question was never fully answered. Was he wrong, or was he simply premature? The unwilling prophet doesn't get to control how his story ends. That is the ultimate tax of preaching to history. Madara envisioned a perfect world, but perfection, when forced, curdles into absolute control. And control, when left unchallenged by empathy, becomes a grand delusion. His greatest failure wasn't the Infinite Tsukuyomi or the Fourth War. It was the fundamental belief that the world was a broken machine that only he had the manual to fix. He died believing that humanity was incapable of healing itself without his intervention. But as the rain falls, Naruto stands there, alive, whole, and unburdened. He wasn't chosen because he was the strongest or the most brilliant. He was chosen because he believed that people could change without the threat of chains. And Sasuke, once consumed by the very vengeance Madara tried to weaponize, was now transforming the system from within. Both men were born of Madara's chaos. Both were shaped by the trauma he orchestrated, but neither was bound by it. There is a profound irony in that. The world Madara tried to bend with the force of a god is being slowly, painfully rebuilt by the very bonds of trust he had dismissed as weakness. "You can't enforce peace, Sasuke," Naruto says quietly, looking up at the stone face of his ancestor. "You can only protect the space where it has a chance to grow on its own." Madara Uchiha didn't see a villain when he looked in the mirror. He saw a healer with a brutal remedy. But history is a cold judge. It does not remember the purity of your intentions. It only remembers the weight of your impact. Madara's lesson isn't that he dreamed too big. It's that he believed only he was allowed to be the dreamer. That is the essence of the unwilling prophet, a figure whose truth lingers not because it was just, but because it was thunderous. His ideology survives scrutiny not through its clarity, but through its sheer crushing weight. He became exactly what every revolutionary fears, an example of what not to become. In the Ninja Academy back in Konoha, children now learn of Madara. Some revere his power, some fear his name. None understand him fully. How could they? Even his enemies didn't. But perhaps that is the point. Madara wasn't meant to be understood. He was meant to be questioned, again and again, until the world becomes wise enough to do better than he did. Madara's life is not a roadmap for the future. It is a mirror for the present. It is a reflection of what happens when pain is allowed to become policy. It shows us what happens when our dreams for a better world outrun our empathy for the people living in it. It reveals the moment when control becomes the mask worn by fear. The unwilling prophet teaches us a chilling, final truth. You can change the world, but if you forget to change along with it, the world will remember you only as the ghost that almost led it astray. Don't chase a legacy, chase an understanding of the person standing next to you. Don't impose peace, build the trust that makes peace possible. Don't become Madara, learn from him. As the two friends turn to leave the valley, the statues of the founders remain behind, frozen in their eternal stalemate. The river continues its long walk toward the sea, carrying the ash of the past away, leaving the living to decide what happens next. The war of the flesh is over. The war of the ideas has just begun. And for the first time in a century, the eyes that are watching the world are finally free.